Before John Marston ever rode out to hunt his old brothers down, there was another figure on the horizon, a lone rider, a broad-shouldered outlaw framed against a dying sunset, carrying the weight of a dying age on his back. That rider is Arthur Morgan, the tragic heart of Red Dead Redemption's entire saga, and the living embodiment of a world that no longer has a place for men like him. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, a family forged in gunsmoke and torn apart by progress. From its humble beginnings in the rough 1870s frontier to its violent end in the early 1900s, the Van der Linde gang becomes a moving experiment in philosophy and survival. It claims to stand for freedom against civilization, for the poor against the powerful, for chosen family against a cruel and indifferent world. In the truest sense, it is both a refuge and a trap. Around Dutch and Hosea, around their speeches and schemes, Arthur grows from a half-wild teenager into the gang's enforcer, surrogate son, and reluctant conscience. The world was changing long before he realized it. Railroads carved through sacred ground, telegraphs stitched distant cities together, and Pinkerton agents arrived with warrants, ledgers, and repeating rifles. Between the 1870s and the turn of the century, the old ways were dying, but the gang rides as if bullets and bravado can hold back history itself. Their camps trace the slow death of an era, from backcountry hideouts and riverboats to the alleys of St. Denis and the swamps of Beaver Hollow. Each new fire they light is a little dimmer, a little more desperate. They tell themselves stories about justice while robbing banks, trains, and ferries. They speak of freedom while keeping their own members bound by fear and devotion. Is this a crusade against a corrupt system, or just a band of outlaws dressing greed in pretty words? In that contradiction, the gang becomes a microcosm of America itself, born out of violence and idealistic rhetoric, promising opportunity while leaving a trail of corpses and broken promises behind. Dutch's speeches about equality echo the language of revolution, even as his choices destroy the very people he calls family. Arthur, the boy Dutch once pulled off a noose, grows into the man who must decide whether those dreams ever meant anything at all. This video will tell Arthur Morgan's complete story, from the very beginning to his final breath, from his obscure childhood and the first time Dutch and Hosea catch him stealing, through the Blackwater disaster, the O'Driscoll feud, the tuberculosis that turns every breath into a countdown, and every major betrayal that shatters his faith. It will follow his relationships with Dutch, Hosea, John, Mary Linton, Sadie, Charles, and the rest, all the way to his last ride and the legacy he leaves in John Marston's hands. Because to understand how the gang falls, the story must start with the lost soul who almost saved it. Because to understand how the gang falls, the story must start with the lost soul who almost saved it. This is Arthur Morgan's saga in full, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a boy dragged to the gallows who grows into the living embodiment of everything the Van der Linde gang once claimed to stand for. This tale will be told from its humble beginnings to its brutal end. It will follow Arthur from the foggy edges of his childhood, through the moment Dutch and Hosea pull him off a hanging rope and turn him into their surrogate son, all the way to the last bullets on a cold mountain ridge and the shadow he leaves draped over John Marston's future. Not just the main missions, not just the loud gunfights and famous heists, but the quiet corners as well. Journal entries scrawled by lamplight, letters never answered, campfire conversations that reveal more than any wanted poster ever could. The narrative will move forward in time, but not as a simple checklist of events. It will trace Arthur's life chronologically while returning, again and again, to the forces that shape him: loyalty to Dutch, the search for family, the hunger for freedom, the slow erosion of faith as civilization closes in. What turns the gang's most trusted enforcer into the man who tells John to run? What breaks the bond between father and son in all but blood? Every familiar milestone will be reframed through Arthur's inner world. The Blackwater disaster will not be just a botched ferry robbery. It will be the moment his faith in Dutch's philosophy begins to crack, even as he rides harder than ever to keep the family together. The feud with Colm O'Driscoll will not be only a long-running blood rivalry, but a mirror held up to Dutch's obsession, and Arthur's growing unease at how far that obsession is dragging them from their idealistic origins. Guarma will shift from an infamous detour to a fever dream where the world was changing faster than Dutch could accept, and Arthur watches the man who raised him slip from visionary to paranoid outlaw. The tuberculosis diagnosis will be more than a plot twist. It will be a death sentence earned in a single cruel beating of Thomas Downs, turning every breath into a countdown and forcing Arthur to question what his life has really meant. From there, the story will tighten around his relationships, the tenderness and regret with Mary Linton, the fraying brotherhood with John, the hard-earned respect with Sadie and Charles. Honor, choices, and quiet acts of mercy will define his redemption in the truest sense, right up to the moment he chooses John over Micah and tries to give the Marston family the freedom he never truly had. But before all of that, before Blackwater and Guarma and the coughing fits in the mud, the story returns to the very beginning, to a roadside in the 1870s, where two con men reach for the same pocket, two guns almost clear leather, and a failed robbery somehow creates a family. The story begins not with blood, but with a bad joke and a worse coincidence. A dusty road, a rattling stagecoach, and two men who both believe they are the smartest outlaw in the territory. The mark is obvious. A rich merchant in a tailored coat, rings on his fingers, city perfume trying and failing to drown out the smell of sweat and fear. Dutch van der Linde has already made his move in his mind, a staged breakdown up the road, a desperate plea for help, a pistol in the confusion, and a speech about how civilization robs the common man long before any bandit does. It is, in the truest sense, performance as philosophy. But Hosea Matthews is there first, riding beside the coach, playing the weary traveler with a bum leg and a good story. He has a different plan, a fake investment, a forged letter, an easy signature, and the merchant robbed without ever seeing a gun. Two cons, one stagecoach, one very unfortunate rich man. When the coach lurches to a halt at Dutch's fake accident, everything collides. Dutch steps out, coat flaring, voice rich and theatrical, already talking about the world changing, about the old ways dying, about how men must take their freedom where they can. Hosea, inside the coach, recognizes the rhythm, the confidence, the sheer audacity. He has seen this kind of outlaw before, or thought he had. Hands drift toward holsters, the merchant stammers. For a heartbeat, it is a story of tension and near betrayal, of two predators suddenly aware of each other. Dutch's eyes narrow. Hosea's smile tightens. Both men calculate the odds of killing the other, finishing the job, riding away alone. Then it breaks. Not with gunfire, but with laughter. Hosea calls Dutch out on his speech, quoting back his own soaring lines about freedom and the common man, twisting them with a veteran swindler's sarcasm. Dutch, instead of taking offense, laughs at the audacity of being robbed while he is trying to rob someone else. The merchant, utterly lost, watches as the two strangers slowly turn from rivals into co-conspirators right in front of him. Here Dutch emerges in sharp relief. Charming, educated, throwing around big ideas about civilization and oppression as easily as he draws a revolver. His rhetoric is already a weapon, a way to justify bending the truth, bending people, shaping the world around his dreams. He is the living embodiment of an idealistic outlaw who believes his own legend. Hosea is the counterweight, older, calmer, eyes that miss nothing, a career swindler who reads Dutch in a moment and sees both brilliance and danger. He knows Dutch is using the merchant, using the moment, and perhaps already using him. Yet something in that wild vision appeals to the tired con man who has spent a lifetime surviving but never belonging. From its humble beginnings on that roadside, Hosea chooses to believe in this impossible dreamer. Together, they finish the robbery as partners, each adding flourishes to the other's act, turning chaos into an effortless performance. They could have killed each other and ridden off alone. Instead, they ride away side by side, laughing, already planning the next score. That decision is the turning point. Two men who meet over a shared lie decide to build a family on shared ideals, a family that will grow, fracture, and in time help burn the world around them. And the next lost soul they take in will change their story forever. From that shared con, a pattern emerges. Dutch provides the thunder, Hosea the weather. One talks about freedom and injustice. The other quietly studies the room, the roads, the timing. Together, they begin to turn petty hustles into something larger, something that feels, in the truest sense, like a calling rather than mere survival. At first, their work is small and nimble. A rigged poker game in a rail town where Hosea palmed the cards, while Dutch distracted a table of railroad investors with stories about the poor farmers their tracks would ruin. A roadside tax collection on a drunken land baron riding home from a brothel, his pockets heavy with cash earned from tenant misery. A bank messenger relieved of his satchel on a lonely stretch of road. Dutch riding alongside and preaching about how civilization was just organized theft with better clothes. Each job refines their rhythm. Dutch spins the philosophy, Hosea improvises the angles, and together they walk away richer, laughing under the stars. Their targets are chosen with care, at least at the very beginning. Wealthy landowners who fence off open range, corrupt sheriffs who skim fines from immigrants, mining companies that underpay workers and overpay guards. Dutch seizes on these choices and turns them into a story of righteous banditry. They are not preying on the weak, he insists. They are striking back at the powerful, punishing a rigged world that crushes anyone without money or a name. Is it justice, or just a prettier word for robbery? For now, no one around them asks too hard. That story begins to draw in its own audience, a drifting ex-soldier who cannot go home, a runaway girl escaping a father's fists, a quiet farmhand who shot the wrong man in a bar and fled before the rope found him. One by one, these lost souls fall into Dutch's orbit, hearing promises of family, freedom, and a life beyond the reach of courts and corporations. Hosea sizes them up with a conman's eye, Dutch embraces them with a preacher's warmth, and the partnership slowly hardens into the first rough shape of the Linde gang. Camp becomes their true creation, not the robberies, but the evenings after. A fire in some hidden hollow, coffee and stew passed around, stories traded of childhoods gone wrong, and futures that might somehow go right. Dutch speaks of a world where the old ways were dying, where men and women could ride where they pleased, answerable only to their own code. Around that fire, the gang becomes the living embodiment of his dreams. No masters, no landlords, no bosses, just an outlaw family bound by loyalty. Yet even here, the cracks exist. That bank messenger Dutch robbed? His wife now takes in laundry alone. The land baron's loss means higher rents for desperate tenants. Hosea notices these consequences in passing, then lets Dutch's soaring words wash them away. Why dwell on the harm when the philosophy feels so grand, so necessary, so much bigger than any single victim? This is how a dream is built with stolen money, one speech, one scheme, one compromise at a time. The gang grows, the legend grows with it, and Dutch begins to believe his own myth. And when the next lost soul stumbles into their camp, a teenage thief with a noose waiting behind him, that myth will finally gain a son, an heir, and eventually, its harshest witness. Dutch's gospel comes dressed in poetry. To a frightened teenager with a rope waiting for his neck, those words sound less like a speech and more like salvation. This is where an outlaw philosophy stops being theory and becomes, in the truest sense, a religion. From the very beginning, Dutch sets out his creed with absolute certainty. Government is a parasite. Corporations are wolves in fine suits. Civilization is a cage built to break the poor. In Dutch's story, the individual is meant to be free, untaxed by kings, unruled by bankers, unbound by laws written to protect railroads and oil barons, while men like Arthur's father rot in prison or die in the dirt. The world was changing, he insists, and the old ways were dying, but that only proves that men of courage must stand against the tide. To make that stand feel noble, Dutch wraps every crime in philosophy. A robbery is never just a robbery, it is a correction, a rebalancing, a blow struck on behalf of the forgotten. He quotes Milton and Shakespeare around the campfire, rails against the tyranny of factory whistles and barbed wire, and tells his people that what they take is already owed to them by a rigged system. A train robbery becomes a tax on corporate greed. A stagecoach holdup is recompense for generations of suffering. Even when the gunsmoke hangs over dead civilians, Dutch insists the blame lies with civilization, not with the living embodiment of its resistance. Yet the cracks are there, even in these early, almost idealistic years. Dutch's reverence for freedom applies fiercely to himself and to his chosen family, but far less to the towns they terrify or the women and children who depend on his promises. A banker tied to the tracks has no freedom. A farmer whose savings vanish in a midnight raid has no say in Dutch's war against progress. Inside the camp, That same pattern repeats. Molly, Abigail, even young Jack live at the mercy of Dutch's plans, not their own choices. What makes these contradictions so hard to see is Dutch's charisma. He believes every word he says. He believes it so completely that others do too. Hosea, older and wiser, recognizes the grift beneath the rhetoric. Yet even he lets himself be carried along by Dutch's certainty, by the dream of one last score, one final escape to a land beyond the reach of civilization. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is already being written in those speeches. For Arthur Morgan, arriving as a lost soul in need of purpose, this philosophy becomes scripture. Dutch is not just a leader, he is a teacher, a father, a prophet of freedom. Arthur will spend decades trying to live up to a dream that was never as pure as he believed. And when that dream begins to rot, the boy who worshipped Dutch's words will be the man forced to measure them against the world as it really is. For Arthur, Dutch's words are scripture. For Hosea, they are performance. That difference, quiet at first, will decide the fate of the entire family. From the very beginning, Hosea Matthews is not a preacher of freedom, but a student of human weakness. He grows up a swindler and stays one, drifting through a world of riverboats and rail depots, selling snake oil, false bonds, and dreams to men desperate enough to buy them. He has seen every kind of lie, the cheap lies told for money, the cruel lies told for sport, and the soft lies men tell themselves so they can sleep at night. So when Dutch spins his philosophy, Hosea hears not just the passion, but the self-mythologizing underneath. Their partnership is a story of contrast. Dutch wants to be the living embodiment of resistance to civilization, an outlaw prophet railing against a rigged system. Hosea hears the same speeches and smiles, because he knows Dutch is also talking to himself, trying to believe that robbery is justice and that their crimes are a higher calling. Who better than a con man to recognize a man conning his own reflection? Yet Hosea does not tear it down. He shapes it. In the truest sense, he becomes the gang's quiet lawgiver. No unnecessary killing, no hurting children. Keep the camps safe, clean, and orderly. Pick targets that at least feel justifiable. Corrupt rail companies, wealthy plantation families, banks that treat people as collateral. Dutch gives the philosophy its thunder. Hosea gives it its limits. Between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization, he draws the invisible lines that keep their story from collapsing into pure brutality. Around the campfire, his influence is even more practical. Hosea is the one who actually teaches people how to survive. He shows Arthur how to scout a town from a balcony before stepping into it, how to read a mark by the way his eyes linger on his wallet, how to negotiate a deal and then walk away when the air feels wrong. He runs cons where both sides are trying to rob each other and somehow leaves with a bottle, a bond, and a new contact. Dutch dreams in speeches, Hosea survives in details. That is why his skepticism matters. When Dutch launches into another grand plan, a ferry job in Blackwater, a bank in St. Denis, an escape to Tahiti, Hosea teases him, poking holes, asking the questions no one else dares to voice. Yet he still indulges the dream, because he loves Dutch, because he remembers their own humble beginnings, because he believes some good might still be pulled from all this chaos. Is that loyalty, or is it the deepest con he ever runs on himself? But the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. As Pinkertons close in and Dutch's rhetoric grows harsher, Hosea's voice grows quieter, his weariness more apparent. Each failure makes Dutch double down, not reflect. Each loss makes him reach for a bigger, wilder promise. And when Hosea's influence finally slips, when the man who said no is gone, the gang's moral center does not simply weaken, it rots. The next decisions Dutch makes will not just risk their lives, they will poison their souls, and Arthur will be the first to feel the difference. Because without Hosea, Dutch still has a philosophy. What he no longer has is a conscience. Without Hosea, Dutch still has a philosophy. What he no longer has is a conscience. Yet to understand why that loss cuts so deep, the story has to return to the very beginning of what the gang really was. Not just a criminal outfit, but a fragile, wandering attempt at a different kind of family. In the early years, the Linde camps are almost peaceful. Mornings begin with coffee over the fire, with Pearson grumbling as he stirs the stew and demands someone bring in meat for the pot. Chores are shared without much argument: hunting, chopping wood, fetching water, mending clothes. At night, the fire becomes a stage. Javier plays guitar, Karen and Tilly sing, Hosea tells long, winding stories of cons pulled in distant towns. And even Dutch himself recites poetry and speeches about freedom. For misfits who have only known hunger, fists, or prison walls, this rough circle of tents feels, in the truest sense, like home. From its humble beginnings, Dutch and Hosea sell the gang as an answer to a cruel world. No bosses barking orders for pennies, no landlords at the door, no fathers coming home drunk with a belt in hand. Dutch tells them that under his banner there are no masters, only comrades, that they are the living embodiment of resistance to a civilization built on exploitation. Hosea, more practical, reminds them that the world was changing and the old ways were dying, so they might as well carve out their own. In their own minds, they are not mere thieves. They are rebels against railroads that tear through homesteads, banks that seize farms, politicians who smile in public and steal in private. Rob a train owned by Leviticus Cornwall, and Dutch calls it justice. Empty the safe of a corrupt town official, and Hosea frames it as balancing the scales. The rhetoric is intoxicating. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, is already being written, but for now, the emphasis rests on the dreams. Of course, even this utopian experiment has rules, though they bend when convenient. The gang does not harm children. They avoid senseless cruelty when they can. They give a cut to the poor when it suits the performance, yet every line has an exception waiting in the dark. Violence becomes a necessary evil, then a routine tool, then an unspoken habit explained away as sacrifice for the family's survival. Who cares if a guard dies, if it means the camp eats through winter? Into this volatile mix walks a boy who has already lost almost everything. Arthur Morgan, the son of a petty outlaw hanged and a mother dead young, is caught stealing as a teenager and dragged before Dutch and Hosea. They see a talented thief, but also a lost soul searching for somewhere to belong. Dutch offers philosophy and purpose, Hosea offers skills and shelter, and the campfire offers warmth no orphanage ever did. Arthur does not simply join a gang. He steps into an experiment that promises freedom, family, and meaning at gunpoint. And for years, he will believe in that promise so fiercely that when the dream begins to crack, he will be the last one willing to admit what it has become. But to understand why that promise holds him so tightly, the story has to go back to the very beginning, long before the campfires and the robberies and the grand speeches about freedom. Before Arthur Morgan becomes Dutch's right hand, he is just a hungry boy in a country that has no use for him. Arthur is born in 1863, in the shadow of the Civil War, probably somewhere in the northern states where the smoke of industry is already rising and the old ways were dying. His parents, Beatrice and Lyle Morgan, have no land, no real prospects, and no safety net. Their world is not one of ideals or civilization, but of scraping by, of moving from town to town, of doing whatever it takes to see the next sunrise. Lyle Morgan is a petty criminal, but to Arthur, he is simply a father who disappears behind iron bars and reappears with less money and more bitterness. Arrest after arrest teaches the boy a brutal lesson. The law is not the living embodiment of justice. It is a uniform that drags his only parent through the mud in public, then locks him away. Every time the sheriff hauls Lyle off, Arthur watches the same ritual of humiliation, and a quiet resentment begins to grow. There is no kindly judge in this story, no charitable matron to intervene. When Lyle is finally caught for good, the sentence is not another stint in a cell. It is a rope. Arthur is still young when his father is hanged, and whatever Lyle's crimes, the impression burned into the boy's mind is simple. The system did not protect him. It killed the only family he had left. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's life is a story of loss, not of reform. Orphaned in everything but name, he drifts. No money, no guidance, no philosophy beyond hunger and anger. Necessity pushes him toward petty crime. He steals to eat, sleeps where he can, and learns to trust his fists and his wits more than any preacher's sermon. Those back alleys and back roads become his school. Picking pockets, breaking into sheds, running when the whistle blows. Each small crime hardens him, shapes him, teaches him that in this world, survival and morality rarely walk hand in hand. Here the pattern interrupts. For all his anger, Arthur is not yet an outlaw in the truest sense. He's a boy searching for a story to belong to. Angry, lonely, desperate for someone to tell him who he is. He becomes the perfect audience for a charismatic man with a grand theory about freedom, family, and the betrayal of working folk by a corrupt civilization. So when Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews finally cross his path and catch him stealing, they do not just find a thief. They find a lost soul, half-formed and ready to be molded. The next chapter of Arthur's life and of the gang's experiment begins the moment Dutch decides that the boy at the end of the rope will be his son instead. Arthur's turning point is not a grand gunfight or a famous robbery. It is a rope, a muddy street, and a boy about to vanish into the machinery of civilization. He is maybe 13, already taller and broader than most grown men, wrists bound, jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. Caught stealing from the wrong merchant, dragged before the wrong sheriff, he stands in a world that has no patience for wayward sons of dead outlaws. In this town, the law is not subtle. Prison if he is lucky, a noose if he is not. This is where Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews ride in, from its humble beginnings a story of timing and audacity. They are passing through, two conmen playing at respectability, when they see the commotion. Dutch hears the charge, hears the word Morgan, and something in it catches. Perhaps it is memory of Lyle Morgan. Perhaps only the sight of a boy being fed to a system he already despises. Either way, Dutch dismounts with purpose. He does not draw a gun. Not yet. He draws words. Dutch steps between Arthur and the men holding him, all easy charm and righteous anger, arguing that this is a child, that hanging him would shame the town, that true justice demands mercy. When talk fails, the edge shows, a flash of steel at a belt, a hand on a revolver, Hosea quietly circling to cut the boy's bonds. In a few tense moments, the mood shifts. The sheriff decides the trouble is not worth it. The rope stays coiled. The lost soul walks away, blinking, beside two strangers. For Dutch and Hosea, this is not charity, it is recruitment. They see more than a desperate thief. They see raw toughness, a quick mind that has survived neglect, and a hunger for belonging that almost hurts to look at. In the truest sense, Arthur is exactly what their philosophy needs, proof that an outlaw family can save those the world throws away. Camp is a revelation. After years of cold looks and colder nights, Arthur finds firelight, stew simmering in battered pots, and laughter that does not stop when he approaches. There are cards slapped on makeshift tables, stories traded under the stars, scraps of stolen poetry recited as if they were scripture. This is not the loveless world that tried to hang him. This is freedom, rough and imperfect, but warm. Dutch talks to him, not down at him. Hosea teaches him to track, to read a trail, to read a room. Together they become, in the boy's mind, something beyond leaders. They are father and uncle, mentor and myth, the living embodiment of a promise that the old ways were dying but something better could be built in their place. From the very beginning, that debt defines Arthur. Dutch did not just spare his life, he gave him a name in the gang, a purpose in every job, a family around every campfire. How does a man ever repay being pulled from the noose? Arthur will spend decades trying to answer that question, and the cost of his loyalty will shape the downfall of them all. Arthur's answer begins with two men who decide what he will be. Dutch and Hosea do not just rescue a boy from the rope, they divide the work of remaking him, each shaping half of his soul. Dutch's mentorship is loud, theatrical, almost religious. Around the fire, in saloons, on the trail, he delivers big speeches about freedom and civilization, about the individual standing proud against a corrupt world. To Dutch, Arthur is not merely an outlaw in training. He is a story of redemption in the truest sense. Living proof that a lost soul can be pulled from the gutter and turned into something noble. Dutch teaches him to read, to quote books he barely understands, to see their gang as more than criminals. Arthur becomes the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, that the right man, in the right family, can stand outside the law and still be righteous. Hosea's lessons move in the opposite direction. Where Dutch talks, Hosea watches. Where Dutch dreams, Hosea calculates. He takes Arthur hunting, shows him how to track in snow, how to move through a town without being noticed, how to read a man's eyes and know if he will shoot or run. Jobs planned with Hosea are quiet, careful, often abandoned if the risk grows too high. From its humble beginnings, Hosea's guidance is about survival rather than spectacle. He tells Arthur that freedom means living to see the next sunrise, not dying for a speech. Between them, a tension takes root. Arthur believes, deeply, in Dutch's idealistic dream of a roaming family beyond the reach of civilization. At the same time, he respects Hosea's caution, his insistence that the world was changing and the old ways were dying whether Dutch accepted it or not. How does a man choose between a grand philosophy and the simple wisdom that keeps him alive? That inner conflict between idealism and pragmatism will haunt Arthur long before he has words for it. To Dutch, Arthur is a crotch to be displayed. Dutch boasts about him to new recruits, points to him as the boy he saved, the man he molded, the proof that his way works. To Hosea, Arthur is a son to be worried over. Hosea scolds him for taking foolish risks, for charging in when patience would do, for letting Dutch's rhetoric drown out common sense. In camp, this creates a quiet triangle: Dutch proud, Hosea anxious, Arthur caught between their expectations. Arthur, for his part, craves them both. Their praise becomes the measure of his worth. Every successful robbery, every act of loyalty, every time he rides back into camp bleeding but alive, Dutch turns it into a sermon. Arthur's courage shows the gang's philosophy is righteous. Arthur's obedience proves Dutch's leadership is sound. The more Arthur proves himself, the more Dutch uses him as evidence, and the harder it becomes for Arthur to imagine a self that exists without their approval. That validation loop will hold him long after the world begins to show just how fragile Dutch's dream really is. That validation becomes a chain. The more Dutch points to Arthur as proof that the gang's philosophy works, the more Arthur feels compelled to embody it, until loyalty is no longer a choice but the only identity he understands. From its humble beginnings, that identity is forged in smaller, quieter acts than train robberies and shootouts. As a teenager, Arthur rides hard between camps, runs messages, watches the horses, and stands lookout in freezing rain while the older outlaws drink by the fire. He learns to shoot not as spectacle, but as discipline, hitting bottles lined on a fence, rabbits in the brush, and later, the silhouettes of men who might shoot first. Each errand is a lesson in nerve, in patience, and how to keep a steady hand when the world is shaking. The older members test him. Bill Williamson barks at him. Javier Escuela teases him. Hosea quietly corrects him when that temper flares. Dutch praises him in public and questions him in private, pushing him to think, to read, to understand the stories behind the wanted posters. This is a story of apprenticeship in the truest sense, not just how to rob, but how to believe that robbery can be a kind of freedom. Over time, the jobs change. When a debt needs collecting from a stubborn rancher, Dutch sends Arthur. When a saloon owner refuses to pay protection, it is Arthur who leans on the bar, calm and unreadable, while his hand rests near his revolver. Dutch speaks of ideals, of a better world beyond the reach of civilization, but when blood must actually be spilled, he prefers it on Arthur's hands instead of his own. Is it conviction or convenience that keeps Dutch one step removed from the worst of the violence? Arthur becomes the gang's primary enforcer, but also something quieter, its center of gravity. He is not Dutch's kind of charismatic. He does not captivate rooms with speeches about the old ways in the dying West. People follow him because he rides beside them in the rain, because he shares the same thin stew, because he is there when plans fail and bullets start flying. When fear creeps in, eyes do not always look to Dutch for comfort. They look to Arthur, the living embodiment of endurance. During these years, Arthur's journal begins to fill. What starts as rough sketches of horses and hillsides becomes a private chronicle of the gang's travels, a story of robberies, camps, and faces half lit by firelight. He draws Dutch, Hosea, John, and Mary Linton, the woman whose family will never accept an outlaw. Between the drawings sit doubts he never says aloud, questions about Dutch's temper, about the cost of their freedom, about whether their dreams are already turning into delusions. The world was changing, even if the campfires made it feel eternal. Railroads spread, Pinkertons grew bolder, and civilization crept into every valley the gang once thought untouchable. The more dangerous the frontier becomes, the more indispensable Arthur is to Dutch's plans, and the more impossible it feels for Arthur to imagine walking away. Because if Dutch is wrong, if this philosophy is just a story told to justify blood and grief, What does that make Arthur, the man who enforced it? That question will not be answered in these early years. But the first cracks are there, hidden between inked pages and half-finished sketches, waiting for the day when one job, one debtor, and one coughing fit will force Arthur to see Dutch, and himself with terrifying clarity. Those cracks around Arthur do not stay empty for long. Into the same orbit, into the same philosophy, another boy is pulled, a different kind of stray, carrying a different kind of anger. John Marston is born in 1873 to a drifting Scottish father and a mother who dies when he is still a child. His father is half-blind, half-drunk, and entirely unreliable, wandering the edges of a world that has no patience for the weak. By the time John is 8, both parents are gone, and from the very beginning his life becomes a story of institutions and indifference. Orphanages, work farms, cold beds, and colder adults who see a mouth to feed, not a child to raise. In those places, the lesson is simple. No one is coming. The world was changing, but for boys like John, civilization does not mean comfort, it means rules, punishments, and distant men with ledgers deciding who eats. He learns to keep his head down and his fists up. He learns that freedom is not given by law or church or state, it is taken. One stolen loaf or one broken window at a time. Around 11, John runs. He slips out of an orphanage and into the Allies and rail yards, surviving by theft, begging, and the occasional desperate burst of violence. Nights under bridges, days dodging sheriffs and storekeepers. He becomes in the truest sense an outlaw long before he ever fires a proper gun. Authority, to him, is just another predator. Why trust a badge, a preacher, or a foreman when every one of them has already turned a blind eye to his suffering? That is the boy Dutch van der Linde meets, another lost soul, thin and feral, trying to rob his way through a world that does not care if he lives or dies. Dutch sees him the way he once saw Arthur, as raw material, as proof that the old ways were dying and that someone must stand up for the discarded. He gives John the same speech about family and freedom, about fighting back against a rigged system, about refusing to bow to civilization's hypocrisy. But the echo is not perfect. Where Arthur, from his humble beginnings, was eager to please, hungry for approval, John is skeptical. Arthur absorbs Dutch's words as gospel, John tests them in argument. Arthur tries to be the living embodiment of Dutch's ideals, John hangs back, watching, weighing, pushing against the edges. He talks back. He questions. He believes, but not completely. Two boys, one father in all but blood, one enforcer and one stray. Is it any wonder that tension grows between them as the years pass and the robberies turn bloodier? Over time, that tension becomes a quiet rivalry, and then something more complicated. Two future fathers learning opposite lessons from the same man. Arthur will try to live up to Dutch's dreams. John will eventually try to escape Dutch's delusions. The seeds of that split are planted here, long before Blackwater, long before redemption is even a word on either man's mind. Those seeds do not stay buried for long. They grow in the quiet spaces between gunshots and campfires, in the glances traded across a poker table, in the way two young outlaws measure themselves against the same man and the same dream. From its humble beginnings, the bond between Arthur Morgan and John Marston is a story of brotherhood and rivalry, of admiration and resentment. When John first arrives as a scrawny teenager Dutch has rescued from a life of petty crime, Arthur sees a reflection and a threat. He remembers being that boy, a lost soul hauled off a noose and told he was special. Now Dutch is saying the same words to someone else. On the surface, Arthur plays the older brother. He shows John how to ride hard without killing the horse, how to clean a revolver, how to keep his nerve when bullets start to fly. He drags him out of saloons, backs him in fights, and, more than once, hauls him bleeding back to camp. Underneath, there is a quieter fear that Dutch's attention and Dutch's future might be shifting away from the son who came first. Dutch, in the truest sense, does not mean to turn that fear into competition, but his philosophy almost demands it. He praises Arthur's discipline in front of John, calling him dependable, an example to the rest. Then, on another day, he claps John on the shoulder and marvels at his daring, his wild courage, the way he charges into danger without hesitation. Each compliment lands as a comparison. Each comparison becomes another reason to prove worth. Who is the better shot? Who brings back more money? Who understands Dutch's grand speeches more completely? Here the contrast begins. Arthur takes Dutch's words as gospel, the living embodiment of a code that explains the whole world. Freedom against civilization, outlaw life as a kind of higher calling. John hears the same speeches and treats them as useful decoration, a clever story that justifies doing what they both enjoy, robbing, riding, staying one step ahead of the law. For Arthur, Dutch's philosophy is a map. For John, it is a good excuse. Yet in those early years, the warmth between them is real. They share jokes on long rides, argue over who shot which lawman in a botched holdup, and tell exaggerated tales around the fire. In one robbery gone wrong, Arthur covers John's retreat against a line of rifles. In another, John doubles back when Arthur's horse is shot out from under him, pulling him up at full gallop while bullets tear through the dust. These moments forge a family that feels unbreakable, but cracks are already there. John disappears for stretches, chasing his own impulses, running from responsibility, questioning orders when they do not suit him. Arthur stays, even when he disagrees, because staying is who he is. He prides himself on never abandoning Dutch, never abandoning the gang. So each time John vanishes, each time he has to be dragged back or covered for, a small resentment takes root. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and neither man knew it yet. For now, they are brothers riding under the same banner. Soon, that banner will start to tear. So when John begins to vanish, it is not just an inconvenience. It is a crack in the image of brotherhood Dutch has spent years preaching, a story of loyalty that suddenly has holes in it. From its humble beginnings, the gang has survived because certain people can be counted on. Arthur rides. Hosea plans. Dutch talks. John, at first, is meant to be Arthur's mirror, another stray, another lost soul turned into a true believer. But even in the early years, a pattern emerges. A job goes bad near the Dakota, tempers flare, and John disappears for weeks. No word, no message, just empty space at the campfire where his voice should be. It happens again after a bloody skirmish with the O'Driscolls. The camp is tense, the law is sniffing around, Abigail is worried sick, and John simply rides off, chasing some notion of freedom that has nothing to do with responsibility. Others hunt, others scout, others move wagons through the mud while watching the tree line. John is not there. He is out in the world, trying to outrun something he cannot name. On the surface, Dutch reacts with fury. He paces, he curses John's name, he lectures the camp about loyalty and duty. He will rant about how civilization is closing in, how every gun matters, how betrayal will kill them faster than bullets. Yet when John finally stumbles back into camp, dirty, half-starved, full of half-excuses, Dutch's anger melts almost instantly. A slap on the shoulder, a rough embrace, a grand speech about forgiveness and family. In the truest sense, Dutch makes it clear that John is special, that his place is secure no matter how often he runs. Arthur watches all of this in silence. He is the one who never leaves, the one who rides into snowstorms, debt collections, and gunfights because Dutch asks him to. He buries bodies, comforts the grieving, and does the dirty work that keeps the gang alive while John is off vanishing into the horizon. How could he not resent it? He judges John as selfish, immature, a man chasing dreams while others pay the price, even as a part of him still cares for the boy he once helped train. But John's disappearances are not just arrogance. They grow from older wounds. Abandoned young, tossed between outlaws and orphanages, John learned early that every promise can be broken, every home can be taken. Commitment feels like a trap, family feels temporary. Staying in one place, with one woman, with one child, with one gang, awakens a deeper terror. What happens when they leave first? So he runs before anyone can run from him. He abandons before he can be abandoned. It is a philosophy of self-preservation born from pain, not malice, and it puts him on a collision course with Arthur's rigid sense of duty. This tension between duty and escape, between loyalty and self-preservation, will not stay buried. Years later, when the gang begins to unravel and the bullets start flying for real, both men will be forced to decide which side of that line they stand on. And this time, riding off will not be so easy. The line between duty and escape was already thin when the gang began to grow. What happens when that fragile philosophy is offered not just to two boys, but to a whole world of misfits, runaways, and killers? The answer is simple. The family gets bigger. The problems do too. From its humble beginnings as Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John riding lean and hungry, the Van der Linde gang became a traveling camp of the unwanted. Each new arrival carried a story of their own, another wound that Dutch could press his thumb into and call it destiny. He did not recruit with coin or contracts. He recruited with words. Bill Williamson came first among the early bruisers, a former soldier who had never been much good at taking orders and even worse at giving them. Dishonorably discharged, half drunk more often than not, Bill wore his insecurity like armor, angry at a civilization that had no place for him. Dutch saw the volatility, but he also saw the use. To Bill, he did not speak of philosophy or the fate of the West, he spoke of respect, of never again being laughed at by officers or townsfolk. In Dutch's camp, Bill could be feared rather than forgotten. Javier Escuela arrived under different stars. A romantic fugitive from Mexico, carrying songs, stories, and a revolutionary's heart, he saw Dutch as the living embodiment of resistance. To Javier, Dutch promised justice and freedom, framed the gang as a cause rather than a crew of thieves. Javier's loyalty was not merely personal, it was ideological, at least in the truest sense that a hunted man can afford ideology. Others followed. Charles Smith, of mixed native and African heritage, brought quiet skill with a bow and a tracker's eye, another lost soul caught between worlds that did not want him. To Charles, Dutch offered belonging without questions about blood or nation. To Sadie Adler, when she would come later, he would offer vengeance and a saddle instead of a kitchen. To Micah Bell, he would offer chaos dressed up as opportunity. The rhetoric shifted with every face. The camp itself became a strange crossroads. Men and women, black and white, American born and foreign, former servants, ex-slaves, gamblers, and drifters, all orbiting a fire that promised they were more than the worst thing they had done. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in that dying light Dutch sold a dream that outlaws could still be a family. Arthur's role in this swelling tribe was simple on paper and impossibly complex in practice. He tested the newcomers on jobs, watched how they handled fear, how they spoke when Dutch was not listening. When trouble came, many went to Arthur first, not Dutch, to complain, to confess, to ask what the gang really stood for. He became the quiet center, the man who enforced the rules and, increasingly, wondered what those rules even were. Because as the tents multiplied, the code thinned. What did it mean to say no harm to the innocent when some joined for revenge, others for profit, and others just to disappear? Every fresh recruit brought another chance for loyalty, but also another crack where betrayal could seep in. The gang was growing stronger on the surface. More guns, more horses, more money. Underneath, the foundations were already starting to shift. The next time Dutch promised that they were all in this together, not everyone would hear the same thing. And not everyone would believe him. On the surface, the gang was a family in motion. Underneath, it was a machine with a very particular rhythm, grinding forward toward a fate none of them wanted to name. The pattern began the same way almost every time. Find a remote patch of wilderness, somewhere just out of sight of civilization, and stake a claim. From its humble beginnings in snow-choked Coulter to the warmer shores of Clemens Point, the gang would roll in like traveling theater, wagons circling, tents going up, Pearson's crates unloaded, the campfire lit. Then came the scouting. Hosea and Arthur rode into nearby towns, watching banks, saloons, and rail depots, listening for whispers about payroll deliveries and rich cattlemen who drank too much and bragged too loudly. Once Hosea had the lay of the land, the real work began. He was the architect, sketching out routes, escape paths, and contingencies in that careful, methodical way that made him the living embodiment of Dutch's more idealistic days. Dutch followed with philosophy and thunder. He gathered the gang around the fire or in front of a wagon, turning a simple robbery into a story of resistance, a story of freedom stolen back from a corrupt world. He spoke of railroads choking the land, of bankers owning men's lives with ink and ledgers, of how this one job would put them that much closer to Tahiti, to Australia, to anywhere that was not here. Then it fell to Arthur and the others to make those dreams real. Bill blew the safes, Javier watched the alleys, Charles handled the horses, and Arthur went through the doors first, gun in hand, the blunt instrument of Dutch's grand designs. A typical heist was a study in contrasts, precise planning and chaotic execution, whispered strategy and shouted orders, the quiet tension of waiting on a hill, and the deafening roar of dynamite and gunfire once everything finally went wrong. When they made it out, when the dust settled and the money was counted, the danger seemed to melt away in the glow of celebration. Music played, bottles passed from hand to hand, and Dutch walked through camp with that satisfied smile, promising that this score was different. This one would get them clear. This was, in the truest sense, the beginning of the end of running. Every new camp carried that illusion of rebirth. Horseshoe Overlook felt open and optimistic, with Valentine close enough for trouble, but far enough for safety. Clemens Point brought Spanish moss and Southern charm, new marks in Rhodes and St. Denis, and new speeches about one last big job. Even Shady Belle, rotten and half-abandoned, was framed as a temporary hardship before the promised land. For Arthur, this life held a romantic pull that was hard to deny. The open road, the camaraderie around the fire, the sense that they answered to no law but their own made him believe, for years, that this was the only way to live. Riding with John on some petty job, trading jabs with Sadie after a gunfight, hunting with Charles in the quiet dawn. These were the moments that made the risk feel worth it. If bodies and enemies piled up behind them, the dust of the trail did its best to cover the graves. But the world was changing, whether the gang admitted it or not. Railroads carved steel lines through the wilderness they depended on. Towns like Valentine and Strawberry grew, brick by brick, into something harder and more permanent. Telegraph wires stretched across the horizon, carrying news of their crimes faster than any horse could outrun. The old ways were dying, and the Linde gang was riding straight into a future that had no place for outlaws who believed they could simply move camp and leave consequence behind. Each relocation bought them a little more time. Each job raised the stakes. And somewhere between those campfires and those speeches, Arthur began to sense that the horizon they chased was not getting closer. It was pulling away. The next time Dutch promised that one last score would save them, the cost of believing would be higher than ever. But as the gang kept moving, the world was moving faster. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang had relied on distance, on the sheer size of the frontier, to stay ahead of consequence. Ride hard for a few days, cross a state line, grow a beard, change a name, and the past would fade behind the next horizon. That had been true in the very beginning. It was less true with every passing year. Civilization was closing in, and it wore a badge that did not answer to towns or juries. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, founded to protect railroads and banks, had become the living embodiment of corporate law. It was, in the truest sense, a private army hired to defend capital, not communities. To men like Dutch and Hosea, who had built a philosophy on robbing the rich and corrupt, this was not law enforcement. It was open war. Railroads stitched the continent together with iron, while telegraph wires carried words faster than any horse could run. A robbery in Blackwater could be reported in St. Denis within hours, complete with names, descriptions, and bounties. Wanted posters no longer yellowed in one county while the next remained ignorant. Information moved, and with it, civilization's reach. The old ways were dying, and the outlaw myth was dying with them. Arthur felt the difference on the ground. After a job, the roads filled with patrols sooner, the questions came sharper, the sheriffs less willing to be bought or intimidated. Bounty hunters arrived in groups, not as lone drifters looking for a quick payday, but as organized teams with fresh posters and clear orders. There is a quiet terror in realizing the hunt has become professional. Some in the gang shrugged it off. Bill scoffed at the telegraph, Javier trusted a fast horse more than any wire, and Micah sneered that rich men had always sent others to do their killing. Hosea, though, watched the Pinkertons closing in at Coulter, at Horseshoe Overlook, at Clemens Point, and sensed the noose tightening. This was no longer a story of outsmarting a few small-town sheriffs. It was a campaign. Dutch refused to accept that. Each new advance of civilization became, in his speeches, just another obstacle for free men to overcome. If the Pinkertons grew stronger, they would adapt. If America was closing, they would flee to Tahiti, or to some imagined land beyond the reach of rail and wire. Why admit the dream was ending, when it could simply be moved further away? Encounters with lawmen began to feel different. The ambushes were cleaner, the timing uncanny, the pressure relentless. Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross did not posture like local marshals. They negotiated, threatened, and squeezed, backed by warrants that crossed borders, and by employers who never showed their faces. How long could loyalty hold against a machine that never slept? Into this tightening world, Dutch's plans would grow bolder and more desperate, each one gambling the entire family on one last score. And as that desperation hardened into delusion, Arthur Morgan would be forced to decide whether following Dutch meant honoring the past or riding straight off a cliff. Arthur's choice would be tested not only by bullets and banks, but by something far more dangerous to an outlaw life, the possibility of peace. Long before Blackwater, before Pinkertons and tropical islands, there had been a girl in a blue dress and a nervous smile. Mary Gillis came from a different world, a respectable family in the growing towns of the New America, where church on Sunday and dinner at a proper table were the expectations, not luxuries. When she met Arthur, he was already Dutch's proc, already the living embodiment of that roaming philosophy of freedom over civilization. And yet, with her, he found something he barely understood. Tenderness, stability, the sense that his story could be more than gunsmoke and train tracks. From its humble beginnings, their relationship was almost a quiet rebellion of its own. Arthur, the rough-edged outlaw who could quote Dutch and skin a deer in the same breath, walking a girl home under the lanterns, imagining a front porch instead of a campfire. Mary, curious and idealistic, drawn to the man beneath the guns and bravado, seeing not a criminal but a lost soul trying to be better than his past. For a time, those walks and letters made him believe that two worlds might meet in the middle. But the world was changing, and Mary's family had no intention of letting their daughter be dragged into the mud with a man wanted in half the territories. Her father's disapproval was not subtle. To him, Arthur was not a misunderstood romantic. He was a threat, a stain on the family name, evidence that the old ways were dying and had to be defended at all costs. Their pressure turned private affection into public scandal, framing the love between Mary and Arthur as something that could not survive daylight, only stolen moments and whispered promises. Arthur stood between two loyalties, the woman who offered him a home and the gang that had already given him one. Dutch and Hosea had raised him from the very beginning, taught him to ride, to read, to see the world through the lens of their shared dreams. Could he really walk away from that for a ring and a quiet life? Or would leaving feel like betrayal, not liberation? In the end, the answer came not with a gunshot, but with a letter. Mary broke off the engagement, choosing the safety of her family over the danger of his. She stepped back into civilization. He rode back to camp. Their paths diverged, yet the wound stayed open. Years later, when Mary reappeared asking for help with her troubled brother, the spark between them was still there, but the timing was gone. Arthur had gone too far down the outlaw trail. He helped her, then watched her leave by train, framed by the smoke of an industrial age closing in. For a brief interlude, this is not a story of robberies or revolvers, but of the husband and father Arthur might have become in the truest sense. Losing Mary convinced him that such a life was not meant for him, that real happiness belonged to other men. That belief, that quiet conviction of unworthiness, would haunt every choice he made as Dutch's world began to fall apart. That quiet conviction meets its first real test in Blackwater. By 1899, Blackwater is not a dusty frontier town, but a polished emblem of the New America. Brick storefronts, electric lights, paved streets, even a proper police force, the living embodiment of civilization Dutch claims to despise. To him, the town is both insult and opportunity. If the world was changing, if the old ways were dying, then why not bleed this new world dry and use its own money to buy freedom? The plan is ambitious, in the truest sense. A ferry, loaded with cash and valuables, guarded by lawmen and private security, slipping across the water under the cover of respectability. Dutch frames it as the one big score they have always talked about, the job that will finally fund their escape to some distant shore where civilization cannot reach them. Hosea, ever cautious, sees the problems immediately. Too many guards, too many witnesses, too much attention in a town that already bristles with Pinkertons. But Dutch overrules him. The dream is too close to abandon now. For Arthur, this is another job in a long line of jobs, yet the scale feels different. This is not robbing a train in the Grizzlies or holding up a stage in the backcountry. This is walking into the heart of the new order and daring it to blink. He trusts Dutch, he trusts Hosea, he trusts the family that raised him from its humble beginnings. That trust is the only safety net beneath a plan balanced on arrogance and timing. Then the timing fails. Or perhaps the arrogance simply meets its match. Accounts differ, memories blur, but the outcome is clear. The ferry job goes catastrophically wrong. Guards fight harder than expected. Civilians panic, scream, die in the crossfire. Pinkertons, already circling the gang for months, swarm faster than anyone thought possible. Gunfire echoes across the water as the night turns to chaos. In that chaos, Arthur is wounded, disoriented, bleeding, dragged along as Dutch shouts orders that sound less like strategy and more like desperation. Money is abandoned on the docks. Bodies, friend and stranger alike, are left where they fall. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, and in that moment Arthur sees something new. Dutch's grand philosophy can fail, and when it fails, everyone pays. The gang scatters into the dark, leaving Blackwater, the money, and several comrades behind. Hunted by Pinkertons, blamed for a massacre, they turn their backs on the shining town and ride north into a gathering storm. Snow is already falling in the mountains. The wind howls, erasing tracks, swallowing curses and prayers alike. They think they are escaping a single bad job. They are wrong. Every hoofbeat toward Coulter carries them deeper into a final year of hunger, paranoia, and death, toward a different mountain where Arthur Morgan will one day lie gasping for breath. Wondering when the path truly turned against them, they ride upward into the teeth of the storm, not as legendary outlaws, but as half-frozen refugees clutching at the last shreds of a broken plan. The snow comes sideways, the wind screaming through the passes, turning the trail from Blackwater into a white, featureless void where horses stumble and men vanish. This is not freedom. This is flight. Wagons splinter on hidden rocks, crates of ammunition and food spill into drifts and are swallowed whole, and the gang leaves behind more than supplies on that climb. They abandon bodies too, forced to bury or simply lose their dead in shallow, hurried graves that the blizzard erases within hours. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, but up here in the Grizzlies, that grand historical shift feels brutally physical, frostbite, broken bones, lungs burning with every breath. When they finally reach Coulter, it barely deserves the name of a town. It is a ghost clinging to the mountainside. Abandoned shacks lean at odd angles, windows broken, doors hanging loose, every surface crusted with ice. The only sound is the howling wind knifing through empty streets, turning each building into a frozen coffin waiting for occupants. This is a story of survival stripped of romance, of dreams and delusions colliding with the simple question of who will live until morning. Inside those ruined cabins, the Linde gang huddles around meager fires that do more to cast shadows than give warmth. Wet clothes steam on makeshift lines. Children cough. Bill and Javier stamp their feet and curse. Micah, ever the opportunist, watches Dutch with hungry eyes, already measuring where authority might crack. From its humble beginnings, as an idealistic band of outlaws railing against civilization, the gang has become a cluster of shivering silhouettes, the living embodiment of how fast fortune can turn. Dutch, of course, refuses to let the story end there. He walks among them with a blanket over his shoulders, like a general among wounded soldiers, voice rising over the storm. He tells them they have survived worse, that this is only a temporary hardship, that one more job will set everything right. He speaks of Tahiti, of mangoes and sunshine, of a future where the gang will be a family in the truest sense, far from the reach of the law. Who would not want to believe him, with the wind clawing at the walls? Yet beneath those speeches, it is Arthur who actually keeps people alive. While Dutch talks and plans, Arthur saddles his horse and rides into the white void to look for John and Javier, to hunt deer in the blizzard, to drag half-frozen bodies back to the fires. He shoulders the rifle, the guilt, and the responsibility, moving through the storm as if it owes him something, as if sheer stubbornness can beat the cold. In his journal, though, the cracks begin to show. The entries from Coulter are filled with sketches of snowbound cabins, of Dutch's profile against the firelight, of tired horses standing hip-deep in drifts. Between the drawings, a quieter story emerges, questions about whether Dutch's philosophy still matches the world in front of them, whether this man who once saved a lost soul from a noose is still the same leader, or only a voice echoing in an empty town. Arthur does not yet speak these doubts aloud, but they are there, ink on paper, waiting for the thaw. Coulter keeps them alive, but it also freezes something in place, the pattern of Dutch promising and Arthur delivering, of grand speeches followed by grim labor. As the storm begins, slowly to break, the gang will ride down from this frozen refuge carrying hunger, debt, and the first hairline fractures of faith that will only widen with each new camp. When the snow finally begins to thin and the gang looks down from Coulter at the world below, they are not riding toward a fresh start. They are riding back into an old wound. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang has been tangled in a feud that predates Blackwater, predates Coulter, and cuts straight through Dutch's heart, the war with Colm O'Driscoll. On the surface, it is a simple outlaw rivalry. Two gangs fighting over territory, railroads, and the right to rob the same stagecoaches. In reality, it is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions turned into bullets. Dutch and Colm once ran together, men with a shared philosophy of taking from a civilization they believed was rotten. But Colm's treachery and the murder of Dutch's lover Annabelle turned a partnership into a vendetta. From that moment, Dutch's crusade against the rich bled into something more personal, more poisonous. By the time the gang is freezing in Coulter, the old ways were dying and the world was changing. Yet Dutch's hatred for Colm has not thawed at all. Even as the camp shivers and starves, even as Arthur rides out to hunt and scavenge, Dutch seizes on an O'Driscoll sighting as an opportunity. Survival takes a backseat to revenge. A scouting party becomes a raid, a desperate camp becomes a staging ground, and the first ride down from the mountains is not toward safety, but toward an enemy Dutch cannot let go. Arthur, the living embodiment of Dutch's promises turned into action, joins these raids because that is what he has always done. He leads charges, kicks in doors, watches men scream and fall in the snow and the mud. How many bodies are left behind in burned-out O'Driscoll camps? How many of those deaths move the gang 1 inch closer to freedom? Each time the answer grows clearer, almost none. The gang's supposed philosophy of striking at the powerful dissolves into ambushes in the trees and executions in the dirt, all in the name of an old grudge. Colm understands Dutch better than most. He knows Dutch's pride, his need to prove himself right, his refusal to be outplayed. So Colm offers truces he never intends to honor, sends messages of peace that are really invitations to walk into a noose. Dutch, who preaches that civilization cannot be trusted, trusts his own hatred even less. He takes the bait, again and again. And every time he rides out, he drags Arthur, John, and the rest of this makeshift family into another trap. In the truest sense, the O'Driscoll feud becomes a mirror held up to Dutch's soul. Colm does not just try to kill Dutch, he uses Dutch to kill Dutch's own people. The cycle of violence pulls their leader off course, turning strategy into obsession and caution into arrogance. Until Arthur begins to see a brutal truth, some of the bullets tearing through his family might as well be fired by Dutch's ego, and this will not be the last time that pride pulls the trigger. Colm's ambush leaves the gang bleeding and rattled, but not broken. Dutch needs a win, something to prove his philosophy still has power, and that salvation is still out there on the horizon. The answer comes not in another mountain storm, but in green hills and open air. Leaving Coulter for Horseshoe Overlook feels, at first, like waking from a nightmare. The snow gives way to soft earth, birdsong, and a sweeping view over the heartlands. Below, the muddy little town of Valentine promises work, supplies, and trouble in equal measure. For a band of outlaws who have been half frozen and half starved, it is almost a return to the very beginning, when the world seemed wide and forgiving. Here, the gang slips back into familiar rhythms. Campfires burn late, guitars and drunken singing drift into the night, and Dutch walks the tents with renewed swagger, preaching about freedom and the next big score, as if Blackwater were only a temporary setback. In Valentine, they drink, gamble, and fight. A barroom brawl can start with a single insult and end with Arthur hurling a man through a window. The living embodiment of the gang's barely contained chaos. It is a story of relief and denial, of routine returning just enough to hide the cracks. Arthur's role in this brief high is clear. He is the enforcer who makes Dutch's promises possible, and the caretaker who keeps those promises from tearing the family apart. When Sean Maguire is captured, Arthur rides with Javier to pull him out of a heavily guarded convoy, trading bullets and insults as Sean laughs his way back into camp. When Kieran Duffy, a captured O'Driscoll, shivers on the edge of execution, Arthur is the one who interrogates him, hauls him around, and eventually watches him try to earn a place among the people who once threatened to hang him. Around Horseshoe Overlook, the violence is punctuated by smaller, quieter moments that reveal who Arthur really is. He drags a drunken Reverend Swanson off the train tracks, saving a lost soul who was supposed to be the gang's spiritual guide. He helps townsfolk fix a wagon, return a lost horse, or fend off harassment, actions that bring him no grand reward but leave faint traces in his journal and in his conscience. In the truest sense, these are the first real hints that Arthur's loyalty to Dutch is being tested by his growing empathy and his discomfort with senseless cruelty. Yet beneath the laughter and the fistfights, the darkness remains. The Blackwater money is still at the bottom of a river, or in someone else's hands. The Pinkertons still hunt them, and Dutch's plans already lean toward risk over reason. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and this warm, lively camp is not a new beginning, but a temporary high before the fall. How long can an outlaw family pretend it is safe when civilization is closing in from every side? For the Linde gang, danger usually arrived with gunfire and galloping hooves. This time, it rode in quietly, hidden in a ledger and a cough. At Horseshoe Overlook, as the gang tried to pretend it had found a new beginning, one routine errand became the moment that sealed Arthur Morgan's fate. Leopold Strauss, the gang's bookkeeper and the living embodiment of cold, civilized cruelty, sent Arthur to collect on a series of loans. No robbery, no shootout, just numbers on a page turned into pressure on the poor. Among those names was Thomas Downs, a struggling farmer already marked by disease. From its humble beginnings, the gang's philosophy had claimed to fight for the downtrodden, but now its enforcer rode out to squeeze a dying man for a few dollars. Thomas Downs was no rival outlaw, no Pinkerton agent, no rich tyrant. He was a gaunt, exhausted man trying to keep a small piece of land alive for his wife Edith and their young son Archie. When Arthur arrived, Thomas was working in the field, coughing, stumbling, barely able to stand. Arthur, hardened by years as Dutch's hammer, treated the visit as just another job. Threats first, then force. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, sometimes turns on the smallest, ugliest moments. The confrontation escalated with brutal inevitability. Arthur grabbed Thomas, shoved him against a fence, demanded payment that simply did not exist. Thomas pleaded, not for himself but for his family. He doubled over, racked by coughs that shook his entire frame, blood already on his lips. Arthur hit him again. Then it happened. Thomas lurched forward, coughing violently, and a spray of blood splattered across Arthur's mouth and face. It passed in an instant. No dramatic music, no warning. Yet in the truest sense, this was the shot that killed Arthur Morgan. Tuberculosis, not a bullet, entered his body in that moment. His death would not come in a blaze of glory, but as the slow consequence of the gang's casual cruelty toward the desperate. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and even disease had become a silent weapon of civilization, cutting down those who lived on the margins. The debt did not disappear, and neither did the guilt. Later, Arthur was sent again, this time to Edith and Archie. Their home was smaller than the gang's grand speeches, their fear more honest than Dutch's philosophy. Edith begged for mercy. Archie glared with a hatred far older than his years. Arthur, who had once been the gang's most feared enforcer, felt something crack. He saw not enemies, but a family destroyed by his own hands. Those encounters with the Downs family lingered. In his journal, in his silences, in the way he looked at Strauss, the seeds of doubt took root. Was this freedom, or just another form of betrayal? He did not yet know that his lungs were already failing, that every breath was borrowed time. But the clock had started ticking, and from this quiet, bloody cough onward, every choice Arthur Morgan made would unfold under the shadow of an invisible, incurable destiny he had unknowingly accepted in a stranger's field. What happens when the gang's strongest gun realizes he is already dying, and that the life he built may not be worth saving? The answer comes roaring not in a quiet field, but in a screaming city. Saint Denis is the opposite of everything Arthur Morgan understands. Smokestacks, electric lights, trams rattling on iron rails, crowds pressed together under posters for banks and factories and imported luxuries. The world was changing, and for a man raised on open plains and campfires, This new civilization feels less like progress and more like a cage made of brick and law. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang had survived by staying ahead of that cage, slipping through the cracks between counties and territories. Now Dutch insists those cracks still exist, even here, in the beating heart of industry. The trolley station job is his proof. He paints it as a story of one last big score before freedom. A clean, controlled robbery in the truest sense. In, out, vanish into the alleys before the city even knows what happened. Hosea doubts it. Others mutter their worries. But Dutch stands in the lamplight, explaining every angle, every guard rotation, every escape route, his philosophy wrapped in confidence. He swears the law is unprepared, the timing flawless, the reward enormous. Arthur, still the living embodiment of loyalty, still the lost soul who owes his life to this man, chooses to believe him. What else has he ever done? Then the doors blow open, and everything falls apart. The law is already there in force, rifles raised, as if someone whispered the plan in their ear. Shots echo through the marble hall. Glass shatters. Civilians scream and scatter, dragged into the crossfire of an outlaw dream crashing into modern order. The gang scrambles through streets choked with panicked crowds and clanging trolleys, ducking behind carriages and market stalls while bullets chew the air. They escape, but just barely. No great haul, no grand victory. Only bruises, blood, and the bitter realization that the old ways were dying faster than Dutch will admit. In a quiet moment afterward, Arthur asks the question that hangs over the smoke. What went wrong? Here, Dutch makes his first unforgivable choice. He lies. He blames informants, bad luck, the cowardice of others, anything but his own miscalculation. His words are smooth, his outrage convincing, yet something does not fit. Arthur was there. Arthur saw the timing, the numbers, the chaos. The pattern breaks. For the first time, Arthur does not only doubt Dutch's plans, he doubts Dutch's honesty. That father-son bond, built from the very beginning on trust and shared danger, takes a crack that will never truly close. If Dutch can lie about this, what else has he already rewritten in his own mind, and in Arthur's? The trolley job becomes more than a failure. It becomes a warning. And the next time Dutch promises that everything is under control, Arthur will remember Saint Denis, the smoke, the screams, and the first big lie he can never unhear. The warning comes too late. The Saint Denis bank job does not just fail. It detonates the gang's illusion of control and hurls its survivors into a different world entirely. In the chaos after Hosea's execution and Lenny's death on the rooftops, Dutch's plan implodes. Surrounded by Pinkertons, hunted through the Allies, the remnants of the gang flee to the docks, seizing a ship in a desperate bid for freedom. It is not strategy, it is escape. A storm tears that fantasy apart, smashing the vessel on hidden reefs and washing Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and a few others onto the shores of Guarma, a tropical island that feels, in the truest sense, like exile from the very beginning of their story. Guarma is not a paradise, it is a plantation battlefield. Sugar barons rule through terror, rebels bleed in the jungles, and foreign interests profit from both. Into this ready-made revolution steps Dutch van der Linde, an outlaw prophet who cannot resist a stage. He listens just long enough to understand the sides, then delivers grand speeches about freedom, tyranny, and throwing off the chains of civilization. Within days, he is promising the local rebels victory, gold, and a glorious future, repeating the same philosophy that once drew in lost souls on the American frontier. But something has shifted. Dutch is not just improvising anymore. He is unraveling. He orders assaults with almost gleeful abandon, trades lives for leverage, and treats the suffering around him as props in his personal drama. When allies die, he calls it necessary. When innocents are caught in the crossfire, he barely blinks. The man who once claimed the gang was a family now gambles that family on rumors of hidden wealth and vague promises that Guarma will somehow lead them all home. For Arthur, Guarma becomes a harsh mirror. Cut off from Hosea's steady wisdom and the familiar rhythm of camp, he is left alone with Dutch's voice, Dutch's choices, Dutch's delusions. Lenny is already gone, Hosea is gone, and the old ways were dying faster than anyone could admit. Each reckless alliance Dutch makes with local warlords and smugglers deepens Arthur's alarm. How many times can a leader abandon allies, betray agreements, and walk away from the bodies before loyalty turns into complicity? The island's feverish heat and political turmoil turn Dutch's paranoia inward. He begins to see betrayal everywhere except in himself. Micah encourages the worst impulses, whispering that only Dutch truly understands the world, that only Dutch can lead them out. Arthur watches as Dutch leaves men behind, withholds information, and invents new enemies whenever reality contradicts his plans. Guarma strips away the distractions of the mainland and leaves only the philosophy and the man. The gap between them has never been wider. When a brutal series of fights and a stolen ship finally carry them back to America, something fundamental has broken. Dutch steps onto the mainland not as the man who pulled Arthur from a noose, but as the living embodiment of his own myth, untethered from consequence. And Arthur, having seen Guarma's madness up close, can no longer pretend that myth is real. The gang returns, but the center does not. From this point on, every promise Dutch makes will carry the echo of jungle gunfire and abandoned graves, and Arthur will have to decide how much more of that story he is willing to live. The gang comes back from Guarma, but the man who once held Dutch to the ground is already halfway gone. The jungle stripped away illusions. Saint Denis will shatter what remains. What happens when a dream that claimed to be about freedom meets the full force of civilization on its own polished doorstep? The Saint Denis bank robbery is supposed to be the grand correction, the last great score to fix Blackwater, Guarma, all of it. Dutch stands in the marble halls of Leviticus Cornwall's world, promising fortune and escape. Hosea, as always, urges caution, reminding Dutch that the city is crawling with Pinkertons, that the world was changing faster than their old methods. Dutch sends him away with Abigail to cause a distraction and keep the law busy. It sounds reasonable. It is, in truth, a death sentence. Outside, Hosea is captured almost immediately. There is no clever con, no last-minute escape, no rabbit in the hat. Milton and the Pinkertons drag him before the crowd as the living embodiment of a warning. This is what becomes of outlaws who mistake rhetoric for power. While Dutch and the others are trapped inside the vault, the law parades Hosea on the street, gun to his head, using him as bait and message all at once. Arthur reaches the window just in time to see it. He watches the man who taught him to hunt, to read people, to negotiate rather than slaughter, held helpless before a city that never cared about his philosophy. Hosea smiles through the fear, tells Milton Dutch will never surrender, and in that instant proves, in the truest sense, that he believed the dream right up to the end. The shot is quick. The impact is not. Arthur can do nothing but pound on glass as the oldest part of his family falls in the dirt. For the gang's older members, Hosea's death is a wound that does not close. The man who once told Dutch when to walk away, who knew when a story of rebellion had turned into a delusion of grandeur, is gone. For the younger ones, Karen, Tilly, even Lenny before the night is over, it means something colder. There is no longer a moral anchor, only a captain and his weather vane. Dutch and Micah seize that vacuum, pushing for harsher reprisals, wilder schemes, more bodies on the pile. Arthur feels the absence immediately. In his journal, the careful drawings of campfires and quiet mornings give way to sketches of Hosea's face, of Saint Denis streets, of vultures circling a nameless corpse. He writes that Hosea was the only one who could truly talk Dutch down, that from the very beginning Hosea's voice had made Dutch's grand speeches bearable. Now every promise sounds thinner, every plan feels like another card in a rigged deck. Without Hosea, Arthur no longer questions just Dutch's decisions. He questions the entire dream Hosea helped tend from its humble beginnings. Was it ever really about freedom, or only about Dutch's reflection in every bank window? If the old ways were dying, had the gang become nothing more than a stubborn, armed refusal to admit it? The tragedy is simple. There is no one left who can reach Dutch on equal ground. The conscience of the gang has been executed in the street, and the man who fired no shot bears the heaviest guilt. Soon, Arthur will have to decide whether he can become his own conscience instead of borrowing Hosea's. And when that moment comes, the choice he makes will determine who walks away from this story of loyalty and betrayal, and who is buried beneath it. Micah Bell enters the story late, but he arrives as if the world had been waiting for him to crawl out from under a rock. Where Hosea was caution and conscience, Micah is appetite and ambition. a man who treats the gang not as family, but as a ladder. From his humble beginnings in a jail cell beside Arthur, he shows his hand immediately, ruthless, self-serving, eager to prove that boldness and bloodshed are the only currencies that still spend in a world where the old ways were dying. Dutch, reeling from Blackwater and Hosea's death, is the perfect audience. Micah flatters him with every breath. To Dutch, he speaks of vision and destiny, of being a survivor in the truest sense, the living embodiment of resistance to civilization's encroaching order. Behind Dutch's back, he sneers at Arthur, dismisses John as weak, and quietly poisons the well against anyone who dares question the new philosophy of one more score. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, distilled into campfire whispers and reckless plans. Micah's proposals are always the same melody, played louder each time. Hit the trolley station in St. Denis. Rob the Braithwaites. Storm the Cornwall refinery. When others urge patience, he calls them cowards. When Arthur worries about Jack, Abigail, or the families who just want freedom from the life, Micah mocks the sentiment as weakness. Dutch hears not the cruelty, but the flattery hidden inside it. Only a great man is worthy of such grand, dangerous schemes. Only a visionary is hated by the timid. Then comes the darker theory, one the game hints at rather than shouts. Micah, the late arrival who always seems one step ahead of the Pinkertons. Micah, who disappears at convenient times, who survives every catastrophe, who is found in the epilogue holed up with Agent Milton's replacement. Was he an informant from the very beginning? Or did he strike a bargain after St. Denis, trading locations and plans for his own survival? The evidence is circumstantial, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Yet blaming Micah alone is too easy. A cartoon villain cannot topple a healthy tree. He can only exploit one already rotting from within. Dutch's philosophy had been cracking for years, his pride swollen by every half-successful escape, his grief over Annabelle and Hosea twisting idealistic talk of freedom into paranoid rage. Micah does not invent Dutch's violence or his contempt for civilization. He merely strips away the last restraints and tells Dutch his worst impulses are actually proof of greatness. So Micah is not the fire, he is the accelerant. The gang, through its choices, its betrayals, and its refusal to see that the world was changing, had already lit the match. Micah simply leans in, smiles, and fans the flames. The real question is not how he ruined Dutch, but why Dutch was so desperate to be ruined, and what that means for the sons who must finally choose a side. Micah may fan the flames, but Arthur is the one who realizes he is standing in the middle of the fire. That realization does not come through philosophy or debate. It comes through blood and a handkerchief and a doctor who does not bother to lie. The collapse in St. Denis is the turning point. One moment, Arthur Morgan is pushing through another job, another errand in a city that represents everything he hates about civilization. The next, the world tilts, sound drops out, and the gang's iron-willed enforcer is on his knees in the mud, coughing until his vision goes black. When he wakes, he is in a quiet, sterile room, under the eye of a weary doctor who has seen this story of the old ways dying many times before. The examination is clinical, almost indifferent. Arthur's chest rattles, his breathing is shallow, and when he coughs, the cloth comes away red. The doctor does not dress it up. Tuberculosis, incurable, months, maybe a year. For a man who has survived bullets, hangings, and frozen mountains, the verdict is almost absurd. Death, not from a gunfight, but from a poor man's disease caught in a debtor's farmhouse. At first, Arthur rejects it. He storms out, furious, muttering that the man is wrong, that he has work to do, that Dutch still needs him. He has been an outlaw since the very beginning of his life with the gang. He has outlived better men through sheer stubbornness. How could his body betray him now? Yet the denial does not last. The coughing fits grow worse. His hands shake when he saddles his horse. Rides that once felt effortless now leave him gasping. Inevitably, his mind circles back to Thomas Downs. That rain-soaked night outside Valentine, when Arthur beat a desperate, sick man into the mud over an unpaid debt. The same man who coughed blood into Arthur's face, begging for mercy. The line is direct, merciless, and in the truest sense poetic. Arthur's own complicity in the gang's cruelty has carved the countdown into his lungs. What does loyalty mean when it ends in this? From that moment, something fundamental shifts. Dutch's grand speeches about freedom and one last score begin to sound hollow, rehearsed, almost delusional. The money in the Blackwater chest, the dreams of Tahiti, the endless promises of one more job lose their power. Arthur starts to see the camp not as the living embodiment of family and resistance, but as a fragile refuge built on lies, betrayal, and bodies left behind. His questions turn inward. If the world was changing, and the old ways were dying, what kind of man had he really been in that world? A protector or a bully? A son or a weapon? He cannot change the past, but he can choose how to spend what little time remains. Protecting John's family, helping the truly vulnerable, standing up to Dutch instead of excusing him, these become more important than any score. From this point on, every mission, every argument, every quiet moment by the fire carries the weight of that diagnosis. Arthur Morgan rides not as an invincible outlaw, but as a dying man trying to decide what his life will stand for when the coughing finally does not stop, and who, if anyone, will be left to remember the man behind the gun. Arthur's diagnosis does not instantly turn him against Dutch. If anything, at first it makes him cling harder to the only constant he has ever known. Dutch is the man who pulled him from the noose, the man who gave structure to a violent, indifferent world. To admit Dutch's failing is to admit that Arthur's entire life, from its humble beginnings in that ragged little gang, might have been built on sand. The doubts, though, have been there long before the coughing. The trolley job in Saint Denis is one of the first clear fractures. Dutch sells it as a clean, clever score, a strike against civilization itself. When it spirals into chaos, civilians are hurt, the take is miserable, and Dutch lies about what went wrong. In Arthur's journal, the admiration is still there, but the lines grow hesitant. He sketches Dutch, then writes of questions and worry where once there had only been praise. From the very beginning, Arthur had believed Dutch's philosophy was a shield for the weak. Now the shield feels thinner. Guarma tears that illusion even further. Stranded on foreign soil, with no camp to perform for, Dutch shows what his ideals look like when no one is watching. He tortures, manipulates, and discards the workers and rebels who trust him. Arthur notes the brutality, the coldness, the way Dutch's speeches about freedom turn into excuses for cruelty. This is no longer an idealistic outlaw leader resisting a corrupt civilization. It is a man chasing his own reflection. Hosea's death at the bank is another wound that never heals. Dutch leaves John bleeding on the rooftop, then later speaks of Hosea as a necessary loss, almost an inevitability in a grand story of progress. Arthur's journal after Saint Denis is raw, confusion, grief, and a dawning sense that Dutch is not mourning the same way. The living embodiment of the gang's conscience is gone, and Dutch fills the silence with bigger promises and thinner plans. From there, the betrayals compound. Dutch refuses to save Abigail, dismissing her capture as a distraction from some imagined one last score. He calls Arthur's pleas disloyalty, insists that questioning him is the true sin. When Arthur warns him about Micah, Dutch does not argue the facts, he attacks the man. That is the pivot many players debate. Is this the moment Arthur truly stops believing? Or is it when Dutch walks away from John again at Beaver Hollow, leaving another son to die so he can escape? In truth, Arthur's faith does not shatter in a single instant. It erodes, grain by grain. Journal entries that once celebrated Dutch's big heart become records of unease, then disappointment, then a mournful clarity that the old ways were dying, and Dutch chose his ego over his family. By the time Arthur accepts that Dutch will not help the one person he now believes must be saved, the break is complete. That final refusal is coming, and when it arrives, it will turn a loyal soldier into a man ready to defy his own creator. That break with Dutch does not happen in a vacuum. As Arthur's faith in his mentor collapses, other voices grow louder, steadier, and far more honest. The story of his redemption is not only a clash between father and son, but a quiet alliance between those who still remember what the gang was supposed to stand for. Sadie Adler enters that story as a victim. From the very beginning, she is found in the wreckage left by Colm O'Driscoll's men, a grieving widow dragged screaming from the body of her murdered husband. Dutch offers her shelter, but it is Arthur who treats her not as a fragile ornament of civilization, but as a person. Over time, the broken ranch wife becomes a relentless gunslinger, the living embodiment of what happens when grief, fury, and a demand for freedom are given a rifle and a horse. Her arc mirrors Arthur's in reverse. She starts powerless and becomes unstoppable. He starts as Dutch's unstoppable enforcer and slowly learns to humble himself. Where Dutch gives grand speeches, Sadie offers blunt truth. When she tells Arthur that Dutch is losing his mind in St. Denis, or that Micah cannot be trusted, there is no philosophy behind it, only clear-eyed observation. Arthur's growing respect for her resilience and honesty stands in stark contrast to his dawning distrust of Dutch's empty promises and Micah's poisonous loyalty. If Sadie is fire, Charles Smith is the calm that keeps it from burning everything down. From its humble beginnings at Coulter, Charles is the quiet presence in the background, hunting to feed the camp, tending to the wounded, standing between the gang and the people Dutch's plans would trample. Half black and half native, he has lived his whole life on the fault line between freedom and civilization, and he understands better than most that the world was changing, and not for the better. Charles consistently puts people above profit. He is the one who argues to help the Wapiti, who risks himself to move the gang's wounded through Pinkerton lines, who reminds Arthur that their idealistic dreams once included protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. In the truest sense, he is what Dutch pretends to be. Together, Sadie and Charles become Arthur's quiet council of resistance. Missions with them form a pattern interrupt in the gang's descent, rescuing John from Sisika, riding with Sadie to free Abigail from Agent Milton, helping Charles shield the Wapiti from military brutality. These are not heists chasing mythical scores. They are acts of protection, of loyalty without delusions. Each time Arthur rides with them, the old ways of the gang briefly reappear, stripped of Dutch's ego and Micah's cruelty. Do loyalty and obedience have to be the same thing? Sadie and Charles answer that question not with speeches, but with choices. They stand with Arthur when he begins to question Dutch, they encourage him when he starts to prioritize John's family, and they stay when others turn away. As Arthur's illness advances and his time runs short, it is these quieter friendships that give him the strength to walk a different path, setting the stage for the final, irrevocable choice between Dutch's dying dream and a chance at a future for someone else. Those quieter friendships give Arthur strength, but it is Abigail and Jack who give him purpose. In a story of outlaws and doomed dreams, this small, fragile family becomes the living embodiment of something the gang has almost forgotten, a future. Arthur's history with Abigail Roberts stretches back to the very beginning of her time with Dutch. She arrives as a working girl, hard-eyed and practical, and Arthur judges her harshly, seeing only another transient in a world of drifting lost souls. He distrusts her motives, resents her influence on John, and views her pregnancy with Jack as a distraction from the gang's work. Yet, as the years pass, it is Abigail who keeps food on the table, who patches clothes, who fights for schooling for her boy while the men boast about freedom. From its humble beginnings as a contemptuous glance, Arthur's view of her shifts into grudging respect. Then into clear recognition, she is the one holding that family together while John vanishes on benders and Dutch chases philosophy. With Jack, the arc is gentler. Arthur is never quite a father, but he is far more than a passing uncle. He takes Jack fishing, tells him stories about the world beyond camp, and tries, awkwardly, to answer the boy's questions about what it means to be an outlaw in a civilization that is closing in. When Jack is kidnapped in Rhodes, Arthur is one of the first into the fire, and the fear on his face when the child disappears says more than any speech about loyalty ever could. In those quiet moments on riverbanks and wagon rides, Arthur rehearses, without knowing it, the father he might have been. Tuberculosis changes the equation. Dutch's betrayals and delusions strip away the glamour from their life on the run, and Arthur, coughing blood into his handkerchief, starts to see John's family as the only thing worth saving. He remembers being abandoned, remembers John being left for dead in the snow years earlier, and understands that the old ways were dying, that the gang's children would only inherit graves and wanted posters if nothing changed. Is this what all their speeches about freedom were leading to? Abigail forces that realization into words. She corners Arthur in camp, demanding to know why John keeps risking his neck for Dutch, why the man who promised family now leaves her and Jack in danger. She calls out Dutch's lies, the endless running, the bodies left behind, and she does not let Arthur hide behind loyalty. In the truest sense, her anger is a mirror, showing him the human cost of every proud decision he ever enforced with a gun. As Beaver Hollow rots in Pinkerton Circle, Dutch refuses Abigail's pleas to let John go, to help them escape. The philosophy that once sounded so idealistic now sounds hollow, almost cruel. Arthur stands between the man who raised him and the family that might still have a future. Which side of that line will he die on? The answer comes in gunfire and handcuffs. When the Pinkertons snatch Abigail Roberts out from under the gang's nose, the story stops being about money, pride, or Dutch's grand philosophy. It becomes a story of a woman and mother dragged into the machinery of civilization, and of what the men around her truly value when the world closes in. Abigail's kidnapping is not an abstract threat. She has already begged Dutch to let John go, already watched her son Jack be taken once before by the Braithwaites. From its humble beginnings, this gang promised protection, promised family, promised that no one would be left behind. Now the Pinkertons haul her away as bait, a living embodiment of the gang's failures. Hosea dead, Lenny dead, John in chains, and the last promise of safety torn away. The old ways were dying, and the enemy no longer just wanted money, it wanted leverage over hearts. When word reaches Beaver Hollow, the camp erupts in panic and anger. Sadie Adler, who has rebuilt herself from grieving widow into relentless outlaw, is furious and ready to ride that moment. Charles is concerned, Javier and Bill look for direction, and all eyes turn to Dutch. This is the very beginning of the end for his image as the unshakable leader. Instead of immediate resolve, there is hesitation. Instead of a plan to save Abigail, there is talk of Tahiti, of escape, of the need to stick to the plan that keeps shrinking every time he repeats it. Dutch's reaction is chilling in the truest sense. He is evasive, dismissive, more preoccupied with his own exit than with the woman he once called family. He suggests Abigail knew the risks, that sacrifices must be made, that the Pinkertons are simply forcing their hand. For Arthur, already sick, already disillusioned, this sounds less idealistic and more cruel. What does loyalty mean if it cannot extend to a mother who has bled for the gang? What is Dutch's freedom worth if it is purchased with Abigail's life? So Arthur and Sadie make their choice. Quietly, firmly, they decide to ride for her without Dutch's blessing. It is rebellion not in word, but in deed. The gang that once rode as one now fractures into two paths, those still clinging to Dutch's dreams and delusions, and those who put people before philosophy. Their assault on the Pinkerton stronghold to free Abigail is brutal and desperate, a small war fought for a single captive, and it proves something Dutch never intended. The gang can act without him. When Arthur returns, wounded and exhausted but successful, the confrontation is inevitable. He challenges Dutch openly, questioning his choices, his loyalty, his refusal to save Abigail or John. Dutch responds not with reflection, but with anger and paranoia, accusing Arthur of betrayal, of being manipulated, of turning against the family that raised him. In that moment, the roles reverse. The son sees the father as the lost soul, trapped in grand speeches and shrinking options. From here, there is no going back. Arthur has chosen his side, and the final act of the van der Linde gang story will be written in blood on a mountainside, where Dutch's last stand against a changing world collides with the man he taught to think for himself. From that realization on the mountainside, Arthur's path narrows. The grand dream of the van der Linde gang dies in his mind long before the gang itself falls. Too many enemies, too many graves, too much blood spilled in the name of a philosophy that no longer matches the man who speaks it. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch refused to see it. Arthur does. In that clarity, he understands a brutal truth. The gang cannot be saved. Not as a whole. Not as a family. The Pinkertons are circling. The O'Driscolls have taken their toll. Cornwall's men and the law of civilization itself are closing in. Dutch has become the living embodiment of his own worst fears, preaching freedom while tightening his grip, talking about loyalty while flirting with betrayal. So Arthur makes a smaller, harder choice. If the dream is broken, then at least one life must be spared from its wreckage. That life is John Marston's. From the very beginning, John and Arthur have mirrored each other, orphan boys turned into outlaws, raised on Dutch's speeches and Hosea's lessons. But where Arthur buried his doubts for decades, John has always run from responsibility, from Abigail, from Jack, from any future that required more than a gun and a horse. Arthur sees it clearly now. If John keeps chasing Dutch's approval, he will die for a man who cannot even save himself. So Arthur goes to him, not as a rival for Dutch's affection, but as an older brother forcing a reckoning. He tells John to stop chasing ghosts, to stop disappearing when Abigail needs him most, to think of Jack's future instead of Dutch's next grand plan. The words cut deep, because they are true. Who better than Arthur, a story of wasted chances and lost soul regrets, to call John out on running away? From there, the final project of Arthur's life begins. He helps John plan an escape in the truest sense, not just a ride out of camp, but a path out of the outlaw world entirely. He pushes for money to be set aside, for supplies to be gathered, for opportunities to be spotted in every town and camp. Each ride to secure cash leaves him coughing harder, each gunfight drains him, each dawn finds him weaker. Tuberculosis is eating his lungs while he tries to build someone else a future. That is Arthur's redemption. He puts John's survival above his own, determined that Jack will not become another boy raised by gunfire and grand speeches. If one man can walk away, if one family can break the cycle of fatherless children and wasted lives, then the gang's long story of dreams and delusions might still produce a single honest legacy. But time is running out. Dutch is growing suspicious, Micah is always watching from the shadows, and the Pinkertons are closing in on Beaver Hollow. To pull John out now will demand every last ounce of strength Arthur has left, and the mountain is already waiting. The mountain does not care about philosophy, loyalty, or dreams. It only cares about who can still stand when the air turns thin and the blood starts to freeze. By the time the gang reaches that final ridge above Beaver Hollow, the story of the Linde gang has narrowed to a single, brutal question: who still believes and who is finally ready to walk away? The breakdown begins in the dirt and smoke of the camp, not with gunfire, but with accusations. Years of resentment and betrayal spill out at once. Arthur calls Micah what he is: a rat and a vulture feeding on Dutch's pride. John, fresh from the noose in the labor fields, stands beside him, the living embodiment of every promise Dutch ever broke. On the other side, Micah whispers poison. Dutch repeats old slogans about faith and family, and the remaining loyalists stare in confusion, wondering when the dream turned into a nightmare. Then the Pinkertons arrive, and the argument becomes a war. The world was changing, and now it announces itself with government badges and rifle smoke. Arthur and John flee up the mountain as bullets chew through rock and snow, scrambling over ledges, horses collapsing beneath them. Arthur's lungs burn with every step, tuberculosis turning each breath into broken glass. His vision blurs, the horizon tilts, yet he still shoves John forward, barking at him to keep going, to reach Abigail and Jack, to escape the fate that has been closing around the gang from the very beginning. What began as an idealistic crusade against civilization's hypocrisy ends with two exhausted outlaws clawing through scree and ice. Arthur takes the worst of the fire, doubling back to hold off pursuers, buying seconds at a time. He knows his body is failing. He runs anyway. In the truest sense, this is his last act of freedom, choosing whose life matters more. At the summit, the Pinkertons fall away, and the real enemy steps out of the haze. Micah Bell waits among the rocks, knife and revolver ready, eyes glittering with hatred and triumph. The fight that follows is not elegant or heroic. It is savage, desperate, two men rolling through blood and dust, gouging, choking, smashing each other against the stones. Between blows, Arthur spits the truth Dutch has refused to hear, that Micah has been feeding information to the Pinkertons since the very beginning, that every death from Blackwater onward has Micah's shadow on it. Dutch arrives to find his two sons tearing each other apart. For a moment, it seems the story might still bend toward justice. Arthur pleads with him to see, to remember who he was from its humble beginnings, when the gang robbed to live rather than lived to rob. Micah snarls that Arthur is the traitor, that John has abandoned the family, that Dutch must choose. Dutch stands between them, gun in hand, eyes hollow. The old ways were dying in his face, and he cannot admit it. He does nothing. That is the tragedy. No speech, no righteous verdict, only a long, terrible silence that says more than any manifesto he ever preached at campfires. The man who once promised a story of loyalty and freedom now watches loyalty die at his feet. From here, Arthur's fate is sealed. The mountain, the disease, the years of blood all converge on this final stand. Yet how he meets that end, what he says to Dutch, to Micah, to the rising sun or the encroaching darkness, depends on the kind of man he has become. Will his last breath be a curse or a blessing? A plea for revenge, or a quiet hope that John's family might yet escape the noose that caught him? Those final choices, and the different deaths they create, turn Arthur Morgan from a mere outlaw into something more enduring. A lost soul who finally found a purpose, or a broken enforcer dragged down by the very gang he helped build. The next part of this story will follow those divergent endings, and the legacy they leave for John Marston, for the dying West, and for the world that comes after the guns go silent. Those divergent deaths do not just close a chapter, they split the entire saga into two parallel legends. In one, Arthur Morgan becomes, in the truest sense, a man who finally steps out from Dutch's shadow. In the other, he remains the living embodiment of the gang's failures, dragged down into the mud by the very philosophy that once promised freedom. In the high honor ending, the last ride is a story of painful clarity. Arthur chooses John, Abigail, and Jack over the money, over Dutch, over every dream he once chased across the frontier. He fights through Beaver Hollow and the mountains, bleeding and coughing, only to turn back and hold off the Pinkertons so John can escape. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur at last accepts that his role is not to survive that change, but to make sure someone better does. This path leads him back to Micah, to a brutal, exhausted struggle on the cliffside as the sun rises over a fading west. Dutch walks away, leaving his two sons to kill each other. If Arthur's honor is high, he dies watching the sunrise, the music swelling into something mournful but strangely peaceful, a quiet acknowledgement that this outlaw has finally found a purpose beyond robbery and revenge. His last words urge John to keep going, to be better, to break the cycle. The low honor ending tells the same story, but through a cracked mirror. Arthur still turns on Micah, still sees Dutch's betrayal, but his choices have stained everything. Instead of a final stand for family, his last moments are spent crawling through the dirt, beaten and stabbed. The camera tilting downward as Micah finishes him in the mud. No sunrise, no sweeping horizon, only the cold indifference of a world he spent his life hurting. Dialogue and music shift subtly but decisively between these fates. High Honor Arthur reflects on regret and redemption, on wasted years and fragile loyalty. Low Honor Arthur leans bitter, angry, half convinced that none of it ever meant anything. Even small details change, the way Dutch hesitates, the framing of Arthur's body, the color of the sky. Two men die on that mountain, but only one feels as if he has escaped being just Dutch's enforcer. The world remembers them differently too. John's epilogue reflections soften when Arthur was honorable, speaking of a man who tried, who saved his family, whose grave is tended and marked with flowers. With low honor, the grave is neglected, the epitaph harsher, and John's tone colder, as if Arthur was simply another lost soul swallowed by the gang's delusions. And here the pattern breaks. This is not a story of a fixed legend told from its humble beginnings to a predetermined end. It is a story of choice and identity, of how a man shaped by Dutch and Hosea can still, at the very end, decide what kind of ghost he leaves behind. The next step is to follow that ghost into John Marston's long road toward his own redemption and the final collapse of Dutch's dream. To follow that ghost, the story has to leave gunsmoke and campfire arguments behind and open something far quieter, a worn leather notebook, filled in Arthur Morgan's rough, careful hand. In the truest sense, Arthur's journal is the hidden canon of his inner life, the place where the gang's feared enforcer turns into a man trying to understand his own story. From the very beginning of 1899 to his final days, Arthur writes about almost every major mission, camp, and relationship. The ferry job at Blackwater, the frozen misery of Coulter, the uneasy calm at Horseshoe Overlook. The false gentility of Rhodes, the choking streets of St. Denis, the rot of Beaver Hollow, each move is sketched and described, often with details that never surface in spoken dialogue. A player can ride with him through chaos and never realize that, back at camp, he is quietly cataloging every triumph, every mistake, every betrayal. Those pages become a running commentary on Dutch's philosophy and Dutch's decline. After Hosea's death, Arthur writes that Dutch don't talk so much about the world being ours no more, a simple line that cuts deeper than any shouted argument. Entries after the botched rescue of John on the mountain, or the disastrous bank heist, show him questioning Dutch's plans, wondering when the dream of freedom turned into blind delusions. He does not stop loving Dutch, but the loyalty that once felt unshakable begins to look fragile on the page. The journal is also where Arthur mourns the dead the gang leaves behind. He sketches Sean with a grin and notes how quiet camp feels without him. He writes about Hosea as the only one who truly saw the world as it was. He records Lenny's death in Saint Denis with an almost stunned brevity, as if words themselves have failed. When Thomas Downs coughs blood into Arthur's face, the entry that follows is dismissive, almost cruel. Much later, as tuberculosis tightens its grip, Arthur writes about the Downs family with shame, acknowledging that his own sickness is the living embodiment of the gang's cruelty. Nowhere is his buried tenderness clearer than in the entries about Mary Linton. Letters are copied, memories revisited, and Arthur admits that, from its humble beginnings, that love was the one thing he never knew how to hold on to. He wonders what kind of life might have been possible if he had walked away from Dutch's world when Mary begged him to. The journal becomes a parallel story of the family he chose and the family he lost. His sketches reveal just as much as his words. Portraits of Dutch, Hosea, John, Sadie, Charles, and even Micah sit beside drawings of elk, eagles, and distant mountains. Towns are mapped in ink, trains and guns rendered with almost professional care. For a man known as a blunt instrument, these images show an observant, almost artistic soul, one who studies faces and landscapes with patience. In a world where the old ways were dying and civilization pressed in from every side, Arthur quietly records what that world looked like before it vanished. Across the journal, the tone shifts as clearly as the changing camps. Early entries echo Dutch's rhetoric, grand talk of freedom, of running from civilization, of staying one step ahead. There is bravado, humor, even a kind of youthful swagger. After Saint Denis and the diagnosis, that voice changes. Skepticism creeps in, then weariness, then something close to acceptance. Arthur starts to measure his days not in robberies, but in chances to do one decent thing. Helping John's family, protecting the Downs boy, standing up to Micah when it finally matters. The last pages are not about glory. They are about the hope that a man who has done terrible things can still die facing the sunrise, not the mud. In the end, the journal is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions written in pencil and ink rather than blood. To understand who Arthur Morgan really is, beyond the missions and the gunfights, his own handwriting is where the complete lore quietly waits, ready to pass from his fading hands into John Marston's, and then into the final reckoning of Dutch's dream. Arthur's handwriting does not end with Arthur. The journal passes forward, and with it, the burden of everything he learned too late. The next man to carry that weight is John Marston, trying to build a quiet life on land that has been bought with blood, regret, and a dying outlaw's last plea. Beecher's hope is more than a ranch. It is Arthur's final request, made wood and wire and sweat: be a better father, leave the outlaw life behind, protect Abigail and Jack from the fate that swallowed the Linde gang. John's days in the epilogue are a slow, stubborn ritual of redemption, fenced post by fenced post. He breaks horses instead of banks, hauls lumber instead of loot, and comes home each night to a family he once abandoned for Dutch's dream of freedom. From its humble beginnings, that ranch is fragile, half-built, and constantly under threat. Yet it is the living embodiment of everything Arthur tried to salvage from the wreckage. Every time John swallows his pride to ask for work, to borrow money, or to apologize to Abigail, he is echoing Arthur's late realization that pride and violence are a dead end in a world where the old ways were dying. John's skills, though, are not those of a farmer. His hands know guns, not plows. His habits are those of a man raised in a camp that slept with rifles close and secrets closer. Dutch taught him to distrust civilization and its institutions, to see the government as a machine of hypocrisy and betrayal. Arthur, in his own way, confirmed that lesson, watching Pinkertons hunt them across the country. So when the Bureau of Investigation finally comes for John in Red Dead Redemption, demanding that he hunt the remnants of his own family, the tragedy is doubled. He is coerced into serving the very system Dutch raged against. Using the skills Dutch and Arthur sharpened in him, there are moments when John speaks Arthur's name, and others when he does not need to. Visiting Arthur's grave, standing over that simple stone on the hill, John thanks him. In the truest sense, Every attempt John makes to do right by Abigail and Jack, even when it costs him money, safety, or pride, is an unspoken conversation with the man who dragged him out of the mud and then forced him to walk away from it. Here the saga bends. Arthur saves John on that mountainside, sends him away from the final gunfire, and in doing so sets in motion the story that will end with John dying on his own porch under a government firing line. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, does not reset between games, it continues. Unbroken, this is the pattern interrupt. Red Dead Redemption is not a sequel standing alone, but the long shadow of Arthur's last decision, reaching from a dying outlaw's lungs to a quiet ranch called Beecher's Hope, and beyond. And yet, for all that long shadow, Arthur Morgan is not a name most people in that world remember. The Pinkertons do not file a grand report about him, the newspapers do not eulogize him. His memory survives in quieter places, in the soil on a lonely hill, in a worn journal, in the way a handful of survivors speak his name. The epilogue returns, again and again, to that hill. John, later Abigail and Jack, ride up to Arthur's grave, reading the simple inscription that changes with honor. High honor marks him as beloved, a man whose end carries the weight of sacrifice. Low honor leaves a colder epitaph, as if the earth itself refuses sentimentality for a brutal enforcer. The flowers that grow there, the view of the valley, the gentle wind cutting across the stones. These are the closest thing this outlaw receives to a monument. Around the map, small echoes linger. A discarded hat in a familiar clearing, a rusted gun on a cabin shelf. Charles and Sadie remember him in fragments, in half-finished stories around their own campfires. Tilly writes of him in letters. Rainsfall speaks of him as a man who tried, in the truest sense, to live by a code even as the old ways were dying around him. Yet even these memories bend under the weight of honor. A high honor Arthur is recalled with quiet respect, as a tragic protector who tried to steer a doomed family toward something better. A low honor Arthur is remembered with fear, with bitterness, as the muscle of Dutch's philosophy taken to its logical, ugly conclusion. Outside the game's borders, another legend forms. Players argue about Arthur as if debating a real figure in American history. To some, he is a tragic hero, the living embodiment of a story of redemption carved out of violence and regret. To others, he is a ruthless outlaw, a man who never truly escapes the blood on his hands, no matter how many final good deeds he stacks against it. Many see him as both at once, a lost soul who can be tender with a dying horse and merciless in a gunfight, depending on the choices made along the way. Those choices allow Arthur's myth to stretch across classic Western archetypes. He is the dying gunslinger, coughing into a bloodied handkerchief as the world moves on. He is the outlaw with a code, trying to protect family in a civilization that brands them as parasites. He is the man out of time, crushed between freedom and fences, between railroads and reservations, between dreams and delusions that began from its humble beginnings as talk of justice. So what does this composite legend mean? When Arthur's story is stripped of missions and mechanics, when only the myth remains, what does his complete lore really reveal about America, about morality, about the stories a nation tells itself about freedom and who deserves it? The answer lies not just in who Arthur was, but in what had to die with him, and what refused to die at all. What had to die with Arthur Morgan was not just a man, but an idea. From its humble beginnings, the Linde gang claimed to stand for freedom, for family, for resistance to a corrupt civilization that chewed people up and spat them out. Dutch called it a philosophy. He spoke of freeing the poor, striking back at the rich, living honest in an outlaw world. In practice, the gang robbed banks, held up trains, shook down debtors, and left bodies in the mud. The gap between the speeches and the reality grew wider with every score. Early on, Hosea chose targets carefully, and Dutch could still pretend they were robbing only those who deserved it. By 1899, that pretense was gone. Thomas Downs was not a robber baron. He was a sick man begging in the street, and Arthur beating him for Strauss's ledger turned the gang's noble rhetoric into a death sentence written in blood on Arthur's own lungs. That tension between dream and deed is not just Arthur's burden. It is a story of America itself. From the very beginning, the nation wrapped conquest, dispossession, and exploitation in words about liberty and opportunity. Arthur is born into that violence and chaos, raised by an idealistic outlaw who quotes books he barely understands, seduced by talk of freedom and loyalty, and made complicit in terrible acts in the name of a cause that never truly existed. How different is that from a country that spoke of manifest destiny while the old ways were dying under its boots? Arthur's redemption does not erase what he has done. It cannot. His victims do not rise from their graves. His tuberculosis does not vanish in a blaze of heroism. What changes is his honesty. In the truest sense, his final months are about refusing to lie to himself any longer, seeing Dutch not as a prophet but as a frightened man clinging to power, seeing his own cruelty in Downes's hollow eyes, seeing John and Abigail and Jack as a chance to protect a child from becoming yet another lost soul with a gun. The world was changing, and Arthur comes to understand that every path has a cost. Freedom without responsibility curdles into selfishness and delusions. Civilization that crushes the poor and the different breeds, outlaws who mirror its violence back at it. Family that demands blind loyalty, that punishes doubt and worships a single voice, becomes a cult marching toward a cliff. Which is worse, law that serves the powerful, or rebellion that stops caring who it hurts? Within this, Arthur becomes the living embodiment of tragic necessity in the Red Dead saga. His failure to save the gang clears the ground for John Marston's story. His final act of courage, turning against Dutch and Micah, forces John out of the cycle and into a harder, quieter dream. A ranch, a wife, a son, and the hope that redemption is not a speech but a life paid for day by day. Yet that understanding has a price. Someone has to die believing too late. Someone has to look back and see the ruins clearly. That is Arthur's role, and it is why his story haunts every step John takes next. Arthur's realization is not delivered only in cutscenes and gunfights. It is written in the quiet spaces between them, in the small mercies granted or denied, in the way the world reacts when his name is spoken. His story is not just a tale that happens to him. In the truest sense, it is co-authored by the hands that guide him through those final, narrowing months. Honor is the clearest mirror of that collaboration. Ride as a man who helps strangers, returns lost wagons, and tips his hat instead of drawing first, and Arthur's tone softens over time. His camp conversations grow more reflective, his journal sketches become more wistful than cruel, and his final words to John carry a weary hope rather than a bitter curse. Choose the path of a ruthless outlaw, and the same face hardens. The same voice turns mocking, and the same death feels less like a sacrifice and more like a reckoning long overdue. From its humble beginnings in Coulter's snowbound caves to the last ride up that crimson ridge, hundreds of small decisions shape how this man is remembered. Sparing an enemy who begs for mercy, or finishing the job with cold efficiency. Stopping to read the letters in camp, or ignoring them as the gang's philosophy rots around him. Opening the journal after a mission, and seeing Arthur question Dutch, question civilization, question his own dreams of freedom, or leaving those pages forever blank. The broad strokes never move, but the shading changes everything. Optional moments deepen that shading even further. Returning to the Downes family after Thomas's death, handing over hard-earned money to a widow and a frightened boy, turns Arthur's tuberculosis from random tragedy into a story of accountability and remorse. Helping Reverend Swanson sober up, dragging him away from train tracks and bottle bottoms, reveals a man who still believes damaged people deserve another chance. Spending time with Jack, teaching him to fish, or reading on the riverbank, reframes Arthur not just as Dutch's enforcer, but as the living embodiment of the father he never truly had himself. In those scenes, a pattern emerges, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family found and family failed. One player's Arthur is a high honor man clawing toward redemption as the old ways were dying. Another's is a grinning butcher who rides into the storm unrepentant. Many fall somewhere in between, pulled between freedom and civilization, between what Dutch taught at the very beginning and what experience has carved into scar tissue. So which Arthur rides in memory now? The weary guardian who tells John to run, or the lost soul who dies cursing the world that made him? Each version carries a different moral texture, a different echo, and those echoes are what keep this outlaw alive. As the tale turns toward its end, the audience does not simply watch Arthur's legend, it becomes the keeper of it, deciding what his name truly means when the guns fall silent. So breathe it in just once, the entire sweep of Arthur Morgan's life. because his story is a story of a man carried along by a dream until the dream breaks. From the very beginning, he is the son of a petty outlaw, Lyle Morgan, a boy who watches his father hanged and drifts into crime with no compass but hunger and anger. Dutch and Hosea do not just catch him stealing, they catch a lost soul dangling over the same abyss they once knew. From its humble beginnings, that chance encounter becomes a philosophy and a family. Dutch teaches Arthur to read, to argue, to believe that their robberies are a stand against a corrupt civilization. Hosea teaches him to hunt, to listen, to see the world as it really is. Around their campfires, the gang grows. John Marston, another stray-turned surrogate brother, Abigail, and, later, Jack, the first true child of the camp, Charles, the quiet warrior, Sadie, the widow reborn in blood. For a time, it feels in the truest sense like freedom, heists pulled with wit, songs shared under open skies, loyalty treated as law. Then the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. The Blackwater ferry job shatters their illusion of control, turning the gang from roaming idealists into hunted animals. Coulter's frozen misery, the fragile calm of Horseshoe Overlook, the decaying elegance of Rhodes and Clemens Point, the haunted halls of Shady Bell, the rot of Beaver Hollow. Each move marks a step down, from confidence to desperation, from philosophy to delusions. Pinkerton's close in, money runs thin. Dutch's speeches grow longer even as his plans grow worse. Arthur's turning points arrive one after another, each a blow he cannot quite shake. The beating of Thomas Downs, a nameless debt in a long ledger, returns as tuberculosis, written into his lungs as punishment for the gang's cruelty. Hosea's death on the steps of the St. Denis Bank tears out the gang's conscience, leaving Dutch unmoored. Lenny falls soon after, and the Guarma nightmare proves Dutch will sacrifice anyone to keep his dream alive. Dutch lies about the money, about Micah, about everything, until even Arthur, the living embodiment of his faith, begins to doubt. What saves Arthur is not an idea, but people. Mary Linton's letters remind him of the life he might have lived. Charles and Sadie pull him toward quiet acts of mercy and furious justice. John, Abigail, and Jack become the line he refuses to cross. When Abigail is kidnapped, when John is left for dead, Arthur finally chooses, not one more score, but one last stand to get a single family out. His legacy is not the bodies he leaves behind, but the chance he buys for John's redemption and Jack's future, forcing a final question. In a world built on betrayal and broken dreams, is that small, stubborn act of loyalty the closest thing to freedom left? And when the dust settles, what does that make Arthur Morgan? A villain who hesitated, or a doomed man who changed too late? Perhaps the answer has already begun to form, somewhere between that first stolen coin and that last breath on the mountain. Because by now, the writer watching this has moved through Arthur Morgan's entire life, from its humble beginnings as a teenage thief about to hang, to the coughing, staggering climb toward a blood-red dawn. In the truest sense, this has been a story of one outlaw's soul laid bare. That journey was not fixed. It bent with every choice. Some rode as a high-honor Arthur, returning lost horses, helping strangers, giving money to the camp box even when the world was collapsing. Others embraced a low-honor path, shaking down debtors without mercy, robbing homesteads, turning the gang's philosophy into open cruelty. Many drifted somewhere in between, pulled between freedom and civilization, between loyalty and survival. Which path did that rider choose, and how did it change the ending that played out on that mountain? For some, the defining image is Arthur, gaunt and dying, turning back to buy time for John, accepting that his own dreams are over so that another man's family might live. For others, it might be a quieter moment, Arthur sitting by the campfire with Hosea, listening to an old man talk about the world changing and the old ways were dying, Arthur sketching in his journal while the camp sleeps, Arthur wordlessly handing a few coins to a starving stranger he once helped rob. One line, one look, one small gesture can become the living embodiment of who he really was. Around Dutch's fire, stories were currency. Tales of train robberies, of outwitting Pinkertons, of two men each trying to rob the other and ending up partners instead. That tradition does not end with the gang's graves. It continues in every retelling, every argument over whether Dutch was a visionary or a fraud, whether Arthur was a lost soul doomed from the very beginning, or a man who carved out a sliver of redemption at the end. In that sense, Those watching become the new campfire circle, modern storytellers keeping this legend alive. Because in a world that often feels as harsh and unforgiving as Arthur's, the stories chosen to be told matter. The men and women chosen to be admired, questioned, or condemned become a mirror. In a collapsing frontier and a collapsing civilization, perhaps the closest thing to redemption is not a clean slate, but an honest story about who someone tried to be when everything fell apart. And as long as those stories keep being told, Arthur Morgan's ride is not over yet, because there is still one more echo of his legend to follow. Arthur's ride may not be over, but even in a story that feels complete, there are shadows at the edges of the campfire. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, but also of questions that refuse to die, haunting the legend long after the guns fall silent. One of the most debated is deceptively simple. When does Arthur truly stop believing in Dutch? Not just doubting him, not just arguing, but losing faith in the truest sense. Some trace it back to Guarma, when Dutch leaves Javier and the others in chaos, clinging to a fantasy of revolution while Arthur coughs blood in the mud. Others point to Hosea's death outside the Saint Denis Bank, when the gang's conscience is gunned down, and Dutch responds not with grief, but with another doomed plan. For many, it is Abigail's kidnapping, when Dutch is willing to abandon John's family for one more score, and Arthur sees that the family he fought for has become a convenient slogan. Yet there are quieter betrayals, too. The way Dutch dismisses Arthur's concerns about Micah, the way he mocks Arthur's illness, the way he forgets, or pretends to forget, the boy he pulled off a noose from its humble beginnings. Perhaps there is no single break, only a long erosion, a philosophy worn down by reality, until all that remains is a frightened outlaw clinging to his own myth. That ambiguity leads to another unresolved question. How much responsibility does Arthur bear for John Marston's fate in the first Red Dead Redemption? Arthur saves John's life, teaches him to shoot, to track, to move through a hostile world with a gun in his hand and an outlaw's instincts in his head. Arthur urges him to escape, to protect Abigail and Jack, to carve out a fragile freedom on a ranch that civilization is already circling. Without Arthur, John dies on a riverbank in Beaver Hollow. Because of Arthur, John lives long enough to die on that ridge, facing an army. Is that redemption, or just a slower execution? Then there is the most painful hypothetical of all. What if Arthur had survived? Could a man so marked by blood, tuberculosis, and the closing frontier ever have found peace? The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur was the living embodiment of that dying age. Some imagine him as a ranch hand in the shadows, an uncle to Jack, a quiet guardian on a distant hill. Others see an inevitable reckoning, Pinkertons or the army dragging him back into the story he tried to leave. Hidden in the game's files and cut content are fragments that deepen these questions. Early drafts hint at more time with Arthur's mother, at different endings, at unused lines in his journal that make him even more of a lost soul than the final script reveals. Unused encounters suggest he might have crossed paths with agents or strangers who would have pushed him toward a different kind of reckoning. For those willing to dig, the community's research turns Arthur's lore into a living archive, a puzzle that keeps expanding. And that is the final mystery, how a character can feel completely known and yet remain inexhaustible. In a collapsing frontier and a tightening civilization, Arthur Morgan's life is not just a closed book, it is an open question. Because as long as the questions remain, there is always one more trail to follow, one more echo to chase in the dust of his legend. Arthur endures because his legend refuses to stay on the screen. It lingers in the mind, in the uneasy space between who a person is and who that person might have been, if different choices had been made and different roads taken. From the very beginning, Arthur is presented as the living embodiment of contradiction. He is a brutal enforcer and a gentle sketch artist, a man who can burn a homestead and then sit quietly to draw a bird in his journal. His story is a story of tension, between freedom and civilization, between loyalty and betrayal, between the outlaw the gang needs and the man he secretly wishes to become. That duality feels honest. Few figures in this world are purely idealistic heroes or irredeemable monsters. Arthur is both capable of cruelty and capable of change, regret, and sacrifice, and that is why he does not fade. His late grasp at redemption strikes even deeper. When tuberculosis finally forces him to confront his own mortality, it is not a sudden transformation but a slow, painful reckoning. He remembers the people hurt for Dutch's philosophy, the debtors beaten, the innocents caught in crossfire, Mary Linton's quiet plea that he walk away. His attempt to help John's family escape is not a clean erasure of those sins. It is a last, desperate effort to put something right in a world where the damage can never be fully undone. How many lives reach that point when the old ways were dying, and it is simply too late to fix everything, yet not too late to try? Control deepens that wound. This is not merely a tragedy observed from afar. The player rides with Arthur, chooses whether to greet a stranger or rob them, whether to help a widow or ignore her, whether to walk back to camp under the stars or cut across the swamp with blood still drying on his hands. The same hands that pull the trigger also turn the pages of his journal, revealing doubts that have been quietly building for years. That interactivity forges a bond no film can fully match. When Arthur falls, a part of the player's own record falls with him. Beneath the gunsmoke, Arthur's struggle becomes a meditation on masculinity and moral responsibility. He has been raised to equate hardness with strength, to treat tenderness as weakness, to believe that the only honest currency is fear. Yet his most powerful moments are those of vulnerability, apologizing to John, comforting a dying Kieran, holding a terrified Jack, admitting to Sister Caldern that he is afraid. In the truest sense, his arc asks whether a man taught to be an instrument of violence can learn, at the end, to be a guardian instead. From its humble beginnings in Dutch's camp to that last climb toward the light on the ridge, Arthur's complete lore is not just a Western tragedy, it is a mirror. It poses a simple, terrifying question. If time were running out, would the chase continue, forever hunting some personal Blackwater score? Or would the gun finally lower, the horse turn back, and one last chance be taken to help someone else escape? The next chapter of this saga begins with the man who lives because Arthur chose the latter, John Marston. The next chapter begins with John, yes, but the road to that chapter has been long, and anyone still here has ridden every mile of it. This has been a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in fire and scattered to the wind, told across more than 2 hours of camps, heists, arguments, and quiet, dying sunsets. Staying through Arthur Morgan's complete lore is its own kind of journey, a long ride across a harsh landscape where the world was changing and the old ways were dying. It asks for the same patience Arthur shows when he pauses at a cliff edge or sits by the fire, staring into flames that never answer back. That time, that attention, that willingness to sit with a man's entire life rather than just his most famous gunfights, turns this from a simple recap into, in the truest sense, a reckoning. Around every camp in this saga, there is a fire, and around every fire there are stories. This space now becomes another campfire. Each playthrough adds a new verse to the legend, the Arthur who rode back for John. The Arthur who chased one last score. The Arthur who wrote every journal page or never opened it once. Which Arthur emerged from the mud, from the snow, from its humble beginnings in Coulter and Horseshoe Overlook, and which Arthur lay down on that final ridge? Those tales belong here. So the comments become a circle of worn bedrolls and tin cups. One player remembers the first time Arthur coughed blood onto his hand. Another remembers the letter from Mary Linton left unread until the credits. Another cannot forget Charles carrying a broken man through the chaos of Beaver Hollow. Around this digital fire, every version stands equal, high honor and low, merciful and merciless. Each one a lost soul trying to find a place in a civilization that never truly wanted him. Beyond Arthur, more trails wait in the dark. Dutch's complete ideology, from the very beginning as half-baked philosophy to full-blown delusion, John Marston's full arc, from reckless surrogate son to reluctant government hound, the hidden stories of Sadie Adler and Charles Smith, the living embodiment of survival and quiet integrity. These are not side notes. Each is a story of freedom colliding with civilization, of ideals tested until they break. For anyone drawn to long-form, narrative-driven lore, this channel stands as a camp that does not rush the tale or skip straight to the final gunshot. It lingers in the pauses, listens to the arguments, traces every line in a worn journal. Those who wish to keep riding with stories told at this pace, with this weight, will find a home here. So the image fades one last time to Arthur Morgan on his horse, riding into the failing light. Not a monster, not a saint, just an outlaw who tried, at the end, to do one good thing. Whether that was enough is a question left in the dust, carried forward by the hoofbeats, waiting for each watcher of this world to answer in silence.